Hello everyone and welcome again to F Sobriety. I am Craig Woods.
And I am James Hamilton.
And James, where are you speaking from tonight?
Tonight I am speaking from home,
Interesting.
as I often am. And yourself?
I am speaking from a lodge out in the woods belonging to the Order of the Ancient Dawn, and I've tried thinking about escaping, but there's some strange noises out there in the woods, so I decided to just stay in here. It's cool though. I mean, I've got a cupboard full of wardrobe, I should say, full of snazzy clothes and shelves full of books, so fuck it, I might just stay here.
Sounds like you're having a great time. Well, while you're there, I'll just be at home listening to some 1950s rock and roll and blues.
Sounds sweet. So James, we are here tonight to discuss Lovecraft Country.
Yes, we are, in episode 3, currently untitled podcast episode.
Yes. And we have just come off episode 3 of Lovecraft Country, which just broadcast on HBO a couple of days ago. So we're 3 episodes into this show, and I guess if you guys are listening to this, you have some interest in that show. Before this show began, I was really intrigued by it. I really wanted to get in about it. I figured it was going to be a show worth talking about. I still think it's worth talking about. Before we get into too much detail, this is not quite the show I expected it was going to be.
I'd agree with you on that. I also feel like it's not the show I expected it to be, for a number of reasons, some of which might line up with your reasons, but some of which maybe don't. We've been talking about this show off air, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And I think what we've discovered is neither of us expected the show to be the show that it is. No. However, I think that you're enjoying the show more than I am, which is not to say that I'm not enjoying elements of it, but I think you're enjoying more elements of the show than I am.
There are elements of the show that I absolutely love, but I will admit, I'm after episode 3, I am at a point now where I kind of wish those things were taken out of the show and given to a different show. But I don't think this show is in any way unworthy. I'm still going to keep watching it. As to how much we talk about it from here on, I guess we'll see how it goes. But I definitely wanted to do at least one pretty sizable episode that we can talk about some of the things going on here, because I definitely think it's an interesting show to talk about.
I mean, I am not the sort to bail out of watching a show just because it's having a couple of iffy episodes. I watched all of Game of Thrones, I watched all of True Blood, so I mean, I'm in for the long haul if I start watching a show, no matter how shitty it gets. I'm there.
Well, I admire your dedication and perseverance.
I'm just saying though, fucking hell HBO, sort it out.
Okay, so some background on this show. It is based on a novel written by Matt Ruff, who is a white American writer. The novel was published in 2016, and the basic purpose of the narrative is kind of deconstructing Lovecraft's racism, while also kind of paying homage to the cult of Lovecraft, as well as all of pulp sci-fi and horror. And if you don't know who HP Lovecraft is by now, you're probably listening to the wrong podcast, because I'm not going to bother explaining that. I'm just taking it as read. Everyone understands who HP Lovecraft is and understands his impact on the horror and sci-fi genre and weird fiction generally.
Yeah, there's a wealth of podcasts and videos out there that go deep into his life.
There is no shortage, definitely. He is a major figure in weird fiction and horror fiction. Yeah, his influence is pretty much ubiquitous. All right, so shall we dive in here talking about these episodes?
Let's do it.
First episode of Lovecraft Country is titled Sundown, and it was directed by Jan de Mange. I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly. And it was written by showrunner Misha Green. Misha Green is a really interesting writer, incidentally. She wrote another series called Underground, which is well worth checking out. It also starred Journey Smollett in one of the lead roles. It's an interesting show, and she's interesting also because she was also a writer on Sons of Anarchy, of all shows, which I just find a bit bizarre that of all shows, that is one that had a black female writer as one of its main writing stuff, but there you go. So, episode 1, we begin with what looks like a kind of vintage black and white war film, gradually becomes Technicolor, and we're just launched into this kind of John Carter-esque fantasy of a battlefield on Mars, various Lovecraftian creatures and figures from, well, it's imagery you would definitely recognise from pulp science fiction. What did you think of this scene?
I think that this scene shot the bolt pretty early, because I was laughing a lot during this scene. I thought it was brilliant.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty brilliant. I thought it was really nicely done. It was so colourful and so frenetic, and there was so much going on in that scene. There was so much information being thrown at you. I thought it was a really interesting way to start this. Probably a good minute into it, I was like, okay, this has to be some kind of dream, because there's no way this is the show. However, having said that, having seen the next 3 episodes that ensue, I'm like, no, actually, this is much more like the show that we got.
Yeah, it's akin to the show. There's a lot of very vivid schlock nonsense.
Yeah, there is. There's a lot of interesting stuff in this scene, though, and this kind of sets up quite a lot of what this show is doing, and in equal parts what I like about it and also what I'm not so much enjoying about it. But we get the main character, Atticus Freeman, Tick for short, and we see him in his military uniform. Now, it's not quite clear who he's fighting here, but all the fighting seems to be going on around him between various factions of Martian creatures and whatnot. What's interesting about the creatures in these scenes is that they are only very slightly Cthulhu-esque. They're way more pulpy than anything Lovecraft would ever have written.
Yeah, they're very cartoony in their appearance.
Very cartoonish, yeah. So we get the narrator on here. We hear this voice that says, "This is a story of a boy in his dream." But more than that, it's the story of an American boy in a dream that is truly American. Now, this voiceover actually comes from a movie called The Jackie Robinson Story from 1950. And Jackie Robinson was the first African-American baseball player in the Major League in the 1940s. And interestingly, he played himself in that movie.
Congratulations, you played yourself.
But Jackie Robinson himself actually appears here in the scene. As he takes out one of the Cthulhu-esque creatures before it can kill Atticus. But prior to that, we definitely have to mention the fact that descending from a ship up above is this red-skinned woman. Now, this woman is played by Jamie Chung, who's a Korean-American actress, and she makes appearances through the next couple of episodes, clearly playing a character who is important in Atticus's past. And I do quite like the way they've teased us with that. But the reference here, I don't know if you got the reference as to who she's supposed to be in this scene.
I didn't. It was mentioned that it was referencing, I think, later. I've never seen, for example, John Carpenter of Mars. Or read it, I should say.
John Carpenter.
John Carpenter? So, hang on.
There's a mashup that demands being made. John Carter is what you were looking for.
Yeah. Because I was just thinking John Carpenter. I always think John Carpenter, to be fair.
If in doubt, think John Carpenter.
You know, it's the old saying, think once, think twice, think John Carpenter.
Yeah, this is from the Edgar Rice Burroughs book, A Princess of Mars. And the character that Jamie Chung is playing is here being a surrogate for said princess, who in the book becomes John Carter's love interest. And John Carter, you know, it's a character that could only been written at that time. But Atticus says a little more about that character as we go in. So he's saved by Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson says, "I got you, kid," and that's a line that will come back a few times. So Tick awakens from this surreal dream, finds himself in the more familiar world. He's on the back of a bus. And of course, this, in the 1950s, is where black passengers are relegated to. So right away, I thought this was a nice segue into the real world that these characters inhabit. I actually quite liked the way they did that. One of my favourite things about this scene is that it's soundtracked by Shaboom. So you get the ultimate example of what was basically white pop music at that time, sounding as innocent as white music can sound, while we're being faced with the reality of what it is to be a black person in that time and place. So they're going over a county line, and Atticus flips the bird at the previous county, saying good riddance, kind of symbolically saying good riddance to white supremacy, he thinks. But what happens next? The bus breaks down, and it shows you just how omnipresent Jim Crow is. And just before that happens, I actually get this middle-aged woman who's also on the bus, a black woman, who says to him, "We're just going over another bridge named after some dead slave owner," which I quite like that line. But looking back now, there are so many lines like this in the show that it has become a bit heavy-handed with this stuff, which is not something I expected to say in a critical way about this show, but it has a wee bit. But anyway, the pickup truck driver arrives, clearly not going to entertain the idea of taking black people to Chicago, so Atticus and this woman have to walk to the nearest town, and that's when she asks him about the book he's reading, and that is A Princess of Mars. And she's quite taken aback by the fact that the hero, John Carter, is a Confederate captain, And I do love this line. She says, "You don't get to put an X in front of that." When Atticus attempts to defend the hero by saying, "Well, ex-Confederate." And Atticus has the line, "Stories are like people. Loving them doesn't make them perfect. You just try to cherish them, overlook their flaws." She says, "The flaws are still there." And he says, kind of talking about his own background, "Someone like me, I don't get to go on adventures. I don't get to defeat the monsters, but kind of, I like to be able to fantasize about it." So the show makes that statement quite early on, and it's a nice statement. I do quite like what's been done there. I come to like it less as the show goes on, unfortunately, for reasons that I will get into as we go on. I will say, though, this first episode, I think is great. And this first episode gave me so much hope about what the series was going to do, which 2 episodes later, I would say it has not really capitalised on that.
Yeah, I thought the first episode was really good, and it seemed to me like it was going to be an essential watch every week.
Yeah.
Not just for the purposes of talking about it in a podcast, but just as a, oh, this is cool. It's a really good mix of kind of weird horror and social commentary, and it's just really nicely shot. It's well acted, but, you know, we'll get to my thoughts on the next 2 episodes as we get to them.
For sure. These opening scenes, I think, are really strong. And I actually rewatched this just during the week because I was trying to get a feel for all of this because I knew we were going to be talking about all 3 episodes. There's so much to love in this first episode. I really think the richness of atmosphere in the period, particularly when we get to Chicago, the production design on this show is off the chain, man. Some of that stuff is so good. By the time you hit Chicago, you feel like you're in the place and you feel like you're in the 1950s, and it is pretty mad. We get to meet Tick's kind of extended family here. So we get George and Hippolyta. George is played by Courtney B. Vance, who's always great, or as I like to refer to him, Mr. Angela Bassett. Hippolyta is played by Ingenue Ellis. I don't really know her outside of this, but she is great in this, I have to say. Now, one thing I loved about this, the first scene we get between these 2 characters is they are being intimate in bed together, and to see an older black couple be in this situation on your television screen weirdly still feels very radical in the 21st century when it really shouldn't, but it does. And I came away from this scene going, yeah, that felt very refreshing to watch that. But it's bizarre that something so simple should feel so radical. So there's definite things I love about this. These are the kind of scenes I was really getting excited about. I was like, oh, this is going to be good stuff. This is going to. If we spent more time with this sort of stuff, I think I would probably still be more positive about the show than I have been 2 episodes later. But anyway, we quickly learn that George is a writer of a safe travel guide for Negroes. Now, this is actually based on a real thing. This thing actually existed. It was known as the Green Book, and it was written by a guy called Victor Hugo Green from the 1930s to the 1960s. And Hugo Green was a mailman from New York. And the Green Book itself was mentioned, it was referenced in the movie, the same name from a couple of years ago, which was, by the way, a pile of whitewash and white savior bullshit. So don't watch that. But anyway, Tick comes back to the south side of Chicago because he's received a note from his father, we learn. Montrose, who's played by the fucking amazing Michael K. Williams, who frustratingly was not in this first episode. Yeah, the great
I get
Omar,
so excited when I saw Omar.
Or indeed Chalky from Boardwalk Empire, or Leonard Pine from Hap and Leonard. Every role that guy plays, he knocks it out of the park. So that's another reason why I was super excited about this show. But anyway, Montrose has been missing for a couple of weeks after venturing out to search for the truth, apparently, of Tick's mother's family history. So this is the first mention we get the idea that there's something in Atticus's family, some kind of legacy, something that's hidden, not spoken about. And this was setting off all kind of fireworks for me. I was like, whatever this is, it's going to be really interesting. It's going to be really exciting because we'd never get to see this kind of. I mean, this sort of story is a trope in itself, but it's not a trope we ever get to see from the perspective, rarely from the perspective of a person of color, and pretty much never of a black person in this particular kind of era, which automatically adds way more kind of obstacles to whatever that journey is going to be. I think we take it for granted in a way whenever a character, if it's a white character specifically, we just take it for granted they're going to be able to cross the country, they're going to be able to do this, they're going to be able to do this and that without really thinking too much about the logistics of it. But if you're a black person in the 1950s, there's a whole other range of considerations. I mean, you could be taking your life in your hands just from moving county to county. And it was this kind of the kind of stuff that I was like, this is going to be really interesting. And I will say, it's that gives us our most terrifying scene later in this episode, which I'm looking forward to talking about. But anyway, Tick's relationship with his father, we come to learn, is a bit problematic. They've had a few disagreements. When his father found Atticus reading horror stories, he forced him to memorize Lovecraft's The Origin of N-Words poem. I'm not going to say the full title of that poem because I'm just fucking not going to. And in a bid to try and get him to read respectable literature, which I think is a great detail. But it also makes us think that Montrose is a bit of a psychopath. So there's an interesting thing going on there. So Montrose has been missing 2 weeks. George seems really nervous about what Montrose might have said in his letter. Tick reads the letter. And I actually thought this was quite interesting. When Tick reads the letter aloud, he makes a few mistakes. He says, I know that like your mother, you think that you can forget the past, but you can't. The past is a living thing. You owe it. I think the idea of owning the past and owing it, two different things. I thought, yeah, there must be a hidden meaning there. And I think they are kind of going in that direction. Because in a way, white culture sort of owns the past, but also the idea that you owe the past. There's, I don't know, interesting things going on there. But you have a secret legacy, which he originally misreads as sacred legacy. A birthright kept from you. And George says that doesn't even sound like Montrose. He's probably been written it under duress, is what they think. His mum's ancestors, Tick thinks it says Arkham, actually says Ardham. I wasn't so keen on that. I don't know about you.
I thought it could have just gone with Arkham.
I feel like
the
they could have just
make.
Same. I don't know why they, and that apparently is also that's true to the novel. Matt Ruff wrote it as Ardham. I don't really get why. You should have just called it Arkham, to be honest.
Yeah. If you're going to call it Lovecraft Country.
Yeah, just push the boat out.
Yeah, it's not like the concept of Arkham and all that is under some sort of strict copyright and they had to subvert it by inserting a D.
Exactly. But anyway.
We don't want to talk about inserting the D until episode 3.
Or episode 2, in fact. Although it doesn't quite get inserted, but we'll talk about that. George says he's going to do some research, and that's it for the moment. We then have an amazing block party sequence, which I fucking loved, man. That whole sequence was amazing. You really got the sense, like I said before, of just being drenched in the atmosphere and the sense of place. I don't know how you found that scene.
I was digging the music mostly. At that point, I sort of got lost a little from anything else that was going on because the music was fucking banging.
The first music we hear is Tierra Whack, and I've seen people online complain about this mixture of old school music and contemporary music, because I think for some people the use of contemporary music takes some people out of it. I don't have any problem with it at all. I actually think it's quite a neat touch, and I quite dig it when shows do this.
Yeah, I've seen it work really well, and I've seen it not work at all.
Yeah, it does depend on the project, for sure. I think what I like about this, though, is the idea that since we are literally in Lovecraft country, there's this whole idea of like physics and the world that we know it not really working the way we expect it to. So I kind of like the idea that the future and the past leak into each other. And for me, that having mixing up the eras in the soundtrack in that way is actually a good way of bolstering that without hammering us over the head with the idea of it, just sort of intimating it. It's one of the nice touches that this show has done subtly, because I will say, unfortunately, there is not a lot this show does that is very subtle. Here's one of the things I do love about this show, and I'm about to talk about one of them here. I love the amount of references to African-American history and African-American culture and literature and art and all those things that this show is thrown into the cauldron. All of this stuff is great for me because every time I recognize a reference, I get so excited. Like this stuff is totally my jam. Like for example, when Atticus goes to visit the local bar where his dad was last seen, the bar's called Denmark Vases, and Denmark Vesey was an African American leader in Charleston, South Carolina, and he was basically a revolt leader. He led a revolt against slavery in 1822, and just having that name I thought was immediately a cool thing. But anyway, he goes there to try and find what the hell is going on with his dad, kind of thing. He doesn't particularly find any answers. The guy that owns the bar tells him that he left with a white guy who looked like one of Bill Haley's comets, which I did quite like that detail.
Do you know what? That was good because you visualise it immediately.
Yeah,
it says everything you need to know. But well, assuming that you know what Bill Haley in the comics dressed like,
right?
But,
exactly.
But if you do, then that paints a perfect picture of this character that you've not seen.
Yeah, and he tells them they drove off in a very fancy car, and we will indeed see a very fancy car later in the episode. For there we go to what is probably my eye of the duck in this episode. Oh wait, eye of the duck? What does that mean, James?
In case our listeners are unfamiliar with the term, maybe we'd better let David Lynch explain it to them.
You know, nature can teach us a lot of things. And there's something about, in painting, you're working within a certain shape canvas. And there's many things that one does intuitively to move the eye. There's repetition of shape, repetition of color. But when you start looking at a duck, you see your eye is moving in a certain way. And you see textures and colors and shapes. And you start wondering about a duck. What it can teach us about, any kind of abstract, painting or proportions or even sequences, scenes. And it always is interesting that the eye is in the perfect place. If you move it to the body, it would get lost. If you move it to the leg or the beak, it's two kind of fast areas competing. Even though the eye is the fastest, it's the little jewel. Well, there's slow and fast. An empty room is a certain speed, and a person standing there is another speed. And that proportion is can be beautiful. If the room is a 2 and the person is a 7. I think a person is around a 7. Fire and electricity can go up to a 9, for instance, or a really intricately designed, decorative room is pretty disturbing. Sometimes it's too fast. But then if you put something slow in it, it could work beautifully. In a busy room and a person, they fight each other. It's a relationship thing, I think. Fast and slow areas. I believe every film has the eye of the duck scene, but it can fool you, which one it is.
Got all that? Okay, cool, because we are going to be using that from now on. So my eye of the duck in this episode is 100% the scene in which we are introduced to Letitia, or Letty as she goes, when she turns up while Ruby, her sister, is performing on stage. Man, I fucking love this scene, dude. How do you feel about this scene?
I liked it. I thought it was good. It's not my eye of the duck. But,
interesting. It's 100% my eye of the duck. But the reason it's my eye of the duck is because I feel like it ties together what I think are the main themes of the show, or the ones that I'm most tuned into anyway. So this idea of extended family and families that are a little bit broken. We do quickly learn that Ruby and Letty have not seen each other for quite a while, and that Letty has spent some time in DC. We gradually learn later that she's been involved with activists, and she's been involved with kind of bohemian characters and whatnot. But we don't know that here. We just know for the moment she's been away for a while and she's come back. Ruby's a little bit sore, kind of takes the piss out of Letty a wee bit. And they have a good back and forth. The actress who plays Ruby is Wunmi Mizaku. I'm not familiar with her outside of this, but she is great in this, man. I really like the on-screen chemistry these two actors have.
Mm-hmm. There should be more of her in the show.
Less
of all the things that we don't like.
Yeah, 100%. This relationship for me is my favourite relationship in the show. And one of the things I do like about episode 3, which we're going to talk about that later, I love that we got more of that, but I want even more. I don't want to just service the plot. I want to spend time with these characters. Like, characterization that should be a thing in and of itself. It shouldn't always have to be a thing that just serves the plot. And what I loved about this introductory episode was, okay, this is the introductory stuff. I'll be looking forward to spending more time with these characters. It's not really happened in a satisfying way since then. But, we'd still have 7 hours to go, so who knows. But anyway, some nice details in here. Ruby says, We haven't sang together since church days. No secret, those days are long gone. Now, I think this is interesting just purely as a side note because I've not read Matt Ruff's novel. I'm assuming you haven't either. But apparently in the novel, from what I gather online, the character of Letty in the book is a bit of a Bible thumper. I don't mean Bible thumper as a derogatory term to describe all Christians. If anybody takes offence to that, I apologise, but that's not the way I meant it. But the term Bible thumper has always colloquially meant someone who's a bit overzealous, and that apparently is, from what I gather online, that's what that character was like. But anyway, while we're talking about Letty, I'm just going to say up front, Journey Smollett is far and away the MVP of the show. She is amazing. I think she's doing amazing work with this character, and I might be even more sick of the stuff I didn't like in episode 3 if it were not for Journey Smollett's performance, because I think she sells every single second she's on screen. But anyway, we learn that Letty is in dire straits, but Ruby is also in dire straits after their mom's funeral, which Letty did not turn up to. What I like about this conversation as well is there is this intimation about colorism. And Letty is quite visibly much lighter skinned than Ruby. Now, I don't know how you received this at first, but when I first saw these two characters on screen together, I was like, oh, this is a classic case of they've cast the lightest skinned black actress in the lead role that they could find. And that's no shade to Journey Smollett, because like I say, she is amazing in this. But Hollywood does have form for this. So I was a little bit skeptical, but then as this conversation went on, I was like, oh no, right, okay, this is actually part of the story. Letty is supposed to be notably lighter skinned than Ruby. And even though they don't say it out loud, this is one of the few examples of where this show does a subtle thing that actually works quite well. Neither of them come out and say, hey, I can get a job at a department store because I'm lighter skinned. But Letty assumes she can get a job at a department store, whereas Ruby just laughs at that. You know, she says, you know how many times I've kind of tried to do that kind of thing. So it's done quite subtly. I did appreciate that. My God, I wish there was more of that kind of thing in this show. But anyway, we do also learn that Letty has a different father than Ruby. And perhaps her father was a white man. We don't know. That's not actually been confirmed. I mean, it could go either way. It's certainly not unusual for siblings to have different skin tones. That's not out of this world, but it certainly seems a possibility. Here's one thing I do not like about this show, right? And yep. I knew I did not like about it on the very first episode because I was getting so frustrated with this. The dialogue in this show. Oh my God, there is so much exposition. There's so much exposition.
We need, do you know what we need?
An exposition klaxon.
We need some sort of you talking about writing from a writer's perspective klaxon, or like a jingle. A jingle's a bit much, but maybe
right, you know. Yeah, no, that's fair. I mean, I will say, as someone who has written fiction and continues to attempt to do so, I do know that it's slightly different in prose because you can find ways of conveying backstory. With screen dialogue, it's obviously different. With screen drama, rather, it's different because you have to find arguably more creative ways to convey things without just putting it in the characters' mouths, kind of thing.
As we talked about last episode, there are really smart, really entertaining ways of doing it. Sam Esmail, in particular, and let's insert filleting Sam Esmail's klaxon into here.
Sam Esmail klaxon.
As we talked about last episode, he does it beautifully with Elliot in the first episode, and it doesn't feel forced, and it doesn't feel like stopping to hold up a big sign saying, here's what you need to know about this character in this situation. But as you say, the writing here stumbles a little.
100%. And as much as I really enjoyed this first episode, I did come away from it thinking, if I'd had a shot for every time there was some unnecessary exposition in the dialogue, I would have been utterly plastered halfway through. One of the things I really hated about this, because the scene I'm talking about is when Atticus and George are getting ready to go on the road. Oh God, man! And there's this line where George is talking about his bad knees, and he explains it's because he was previously attacked while on the road, while working on the guide. And Atticus says, and it's the most unnecessary line, he says, "That's why you published the guidebook, though, to keep us Negroes safe." It's like, we know that already, because we saw the book. The director went out of their way to show us the book in the window. The title is self-explanatory. What is this dialogue doing here? Get it to fuck, man. Anyway, on the plus side here, we also get to spend a lot more time with their daughter, Dee, who I really like. I think she's a really good side character. And she has this illustrated guidebook. And she also makes comics. I think it's interesting that they've chosen to show her comics drawn in a very contemporary style that no one would draw in the 1950s. Like, surely that's got to be deliberate. I just think it's a nice touch, and it goes back to my earlier comment about there being a Lovecraftian timey-wimey thing going on here. But George is saying that this Ardham is in Devon County, Massachusetts, and George is insisting on coming. That nothing's going to go wrong, it'll be fine, kind of thing. And Atticus says, maybe you'll think twice about that when you see this. And he shows him what Dee has put in her illustrated guidebook, and it's this Grim Reaper symbol over where Devon County is. Now, on the one hand, that's really heavy-handed. On the other hand, I like the fact that they've not yet explained why Dee seems to know stuff. She just seems to have this sixth sense that she knows things, and I quite dig that. And there's been little hints. There was little hints of it in episode 3 as well, which I did quite like. In fact, I was so fearful in episode 3 when she appeared on screen, because I was like, the way this episode is going, they're just going to come out and she's going to start, turning into Jean Grey or something. But they still kept it subtle for now. But I'll mention what I mean by that when we get to it. I like the little scene here where Atticus spends the night in his dad's apartment. I was going to say flat. Guys, if you're listening in North America or such places, flat is what we call an apartment. Don't ask why. Just accept it. Montrose owns many copies of The Count of Monte Cristo, which I thought was an interesting detail. If you know The Count of Monte Cristo.
Oh, you're asking me. I thought you were asking the audience.
Well, they cannot answer me, James.
That's why I left such a long pause between the question and the answer.
Wait for the emails to flood in.
I have never read The Count of Monte Cristo. So
the Count of Monte Cristo, the main character, Edmond Dantes, is falsely accused as a supporter of Napoleon after he's promoted as a captain on the ship that he works as a crewmate on. And he's accused by a guy who fancies his girlfriend, basically. And he ends up going to prison, and over 15 years in prison, he digs a tunnel out and in the meantime hatches a scheme to insert himself in the kind of upper echelons of society, after which he will execute vicious revenge on everyone who framed him. And it's a whole idea of a birthright being reclaimed, and the whole idea of revenge, reparations. It will also have, in this case, a real echo in terms of Montrose's escape in episode 2. But it also makes me think maybe it's kind of trying to imply that given Atticus's birthright, is there some way in which Atticus is going to kind of exact revenge on white supremacy? I don't know. I find that an interesting idea, and that's one of the things that's keeping me plugged into the show, but we'll see where it goes. Montrose also has a gun, interestingly, so he takes that with him. The night before they leave, Tick makes a phone call to South Korea, and the voice that answers is Jamie Chung's voice, and she says to him, "You went back," and she says, "You shouldn't have," and hangs up. And it's all very sinister and a bit spooky, so we know something happened out in South Korea with this woman. So Letty joins them on the journey because, being short of funds, her brother's place is on the way, so she decides that she can stop off there. And that seems to be her plan. It is all a bit convenient, and there is a bit more exposition here when Tick says, "Oh, why, it's you, Letty, the only girl of our sci-fi club back in the day. Remember when you were the only girl in the sci-fi club we had, in which you were the only girl?" I'm like, fucking stop this, man. Why is this dialogue here? I hate this.
Wait, I don't quite recall that scene. Are you telling me that Letty was in a sci-fi club with him in school.
Apparently there was a sci-fi and pulp fiction kind of club that they all were in together. It was all boys apart from, there was one girl in it. Oh, guys, wait, Letty was the one girl. Did we mention that? Anyway, Letty was the one girl in the sci-fi club. Anyway, who talks like this?
I overlooked that point. How could I have been so foolish? It hammered into my face.
It's like if we weren't in touch for a couple of years and I bumped into you in the street and I said, "Oh, James, remember that podcast we did? We did you and me called F Sobriety with me and you. Remember that?"
Oh, and it was the podcast that we did. We recorded the podcast and we put the podcast up.
It drove me nuts, that scene. But these are the kind of little things I really dislike. There will be things I dislike more than this later, particularly in episodes 2 and 3, but let's press on. When the gang are making their journey across the States, now I really like this. We have audio clip of a James Baldwin speech. It actually comes from James Baldwin's debate with William F. Buckley in 1965. So this is another example of a soundbite being used that's not contemporaneous with the time period in which the story is set. And I did dig it because the stuff that Baldwin is saying here is 100%, it's been true since time immemorial. So the idea that the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro and that one's perception of reality largely dictates how much one can possibly believe in the idea of the American dream, and that essentially black people in the States occupy an entirely different reality from white people. And I think there's a nice, both a literal interpretation of that for these characters and also a kind of more surreal, textual, Lovecraftian element to it as well, which I think at this point I was excited about this because I thought, well, I can't wait for them to expound on this. They still have not done so. Another thing I liked here as they're going across the country, there's recreations of famous historical photographs but just presented as though they were passing by those scenes. I thought that was a really nice touch. There is, particularly they pass by a line of black Americans waiting for the bus, and there's the poster behind them really quite ironically claiming there's no way like the American way, and that the US has the world's highest standard of living. That's based on a very famous photograph taken by a photographer called Margaret Burke White for Life magazine in the 1930s. Yeah, it's pretty great, and I had a jump out the seat moment when that happened. This is the kind of thing I wish the show would do more of, to be honest. Okay, so here is where I started to think, this is not the show that I thought this was going to be, because this road trip goes by so fast.
I thought that the road trip was going to be the series, I'm not going to lie. I thought it was going to be, or at least the lion's share of it was going to be, you would get a look at a group of African Americans travelling across a United States that is, at the time was unsafe to do for them. And that there would always be that sense of creeping dread that somehow the idea of that Lovecraftian sense of like doom and hopelessness was going to translate into something that was humanly relatable more than a sort of alien terror, and it would be, I don't know, that was what I thought they were going for, and I was wrong.
Same. I really thought the road trip would take up at least 50% of the season. But again, this is partly my fault with coming on board with certain preconceptions and expectations, which the show itself had zero interest in delivering. So it is my fault. I just had ideas where I guess I wanted the show to go, and it turned out to be a different show from the one I was expecting / hoping for. But anyway, there are good moments in this brief road trip. George identifies this place, Lydia's Diner, because it's mentioned in the guide as a place that's friendly to black people, even though it has a white owner. As they're entering this town, we get the racist dog at the fire station. And this is a long tradition in the States. Racist dogs are a thing. Dogs are trained to attack black people, and this has been a thing that has existed in the States since, back in the days of slavery, because obviously, if a slave tried to escape, you want an animal that's trained to pounce on anyone with dark skin moving quickly. And so, and it's a big thing that's referenced again and again in American popular culture. I did appreciate it here. I thought it was when Tick notices and we get the slow motion of the dog barking. I did find that genuinely chilling, and it's one of the few things in the show that I found genuinely chilling. And for me, I will say before we get to the scene in question, the most chilling stuff in this show is the racism, and so it is the real life kind of the things about the sundown town and the racist sheriffs. These are the terrifying things about this show.
The barking dog moment was my Eye of the Duck scene.
Ah, okay.
Funnily enough. So
more like Eye of the Dug.
Oh.
So they turn up at this place. I like Letty's sass as they walk by the white women, kind of looking at them, scandalised, and she pulls down her sunglasses and sort of gives them that sassy look. Well, I love all that shit. They go in there. The guy at the counter is having no truck with it. The soda jerk, as they call him in the States, is very nervous, kind of makes an excuse to go in the back room. I like what Letty does here. She does the sensible thing. She does what I call the toilet scout, where whenever you're in an unfamiliar place, you go to the toilet immediately, because then you get a view of everything. And that's what she does. She goes to suss everything out. And of course, she goes there, she overhears the soda jerk talking to some guy saying, "I swear I didn't serve them, not after what you did to Miss Lydia." So Letty quickly realises this is not above board, and this is now a bad place. I did not like Tick's realisation about, remind me why the White House had to be white. There was no need for that. There was no need for that dialogue. It was pointless. It added nothing. Letty running back in and say, "Get your ass up, we got to get the fuck out of here right now," was 10 times more effective than any of the Tick staring at the white bricks and saying, "Remind me why." Nobody would say this. You would just say, "Here, I think this place has been burnt."
Yeah. There was a little bit of the writer enjoying their own cleverness to that.
Yeah,
scene.
100%, and that was my problem with it. So the fire brigade turn up.
The racist fire brigade.
The racist
the
fire
worst
brigade
kind.
turn up to chase them out of town. And this is the first of two chase scenes, the lesser of two chase scenes. The next one we get will be utterly terrifying. But this one, yeah, a bunch of racist douchebags fire at them. Letty does some mad skills driving. Get exchange of gunfire. Oh, yeah, another bit I really did not like here. George does, in fact, utter the line, "They're gaining on us." It's like, oh boy. In neon flashing block capital letters, no. Anyway, we get the flashy car, which cuts off the pursuers. There's a bit of a telekinetic force field thing going on. The car does a magic flip. And then the whitest girl you've ever seen gets out and looks off after our gang as they make their escape. And we think, who the fuck is this person? And I did write in my notes here, literal white saviour.
Do you think they were lampshading that, or do you think it's just not very well written?
At this point, I'm not sure. I think I would have been definitely more prepared to give them the benefit of the doubt for the former rather than the latter at the time when I watched the first episode. But we stop over at Marvin's house. Marvin is Letty's half-brother. So Marvin has done some research on Devon County, says it's all gotten a bit strange. There's the county seat of a town, which he pronounces as Bideford. It's named after the English town, which, by the way, is pronounced Bideford, where they had one of the last witch trials. This, incidentally, is true. In Bideford, the last witch trial occurred in 1682, involving 3 women who were accused of witchcraft, and which resulted in one of the last hangings for witchcraft in England. The charges were, I've written down here, suspicion of having used some magical art, sorcery, or witchcraft upon the body of Grace Thomas, and to have had discourse or familiarity with the devil in the likeness or shape of a black man. So that is a true thing that happened. Bideford in the US was apparently founded by witch hunters who do not like outsiders. There have been stories of travellers attacked in the woods around the town and missing persons, and which Marvin reckons is probably down to the current sheriff, guy named Eustace Hunt, which I've written in my notes as possible rhyming slang, ?
Very possibly.
But another thing I did thought was quite laughable in this scene was Marvin says he's got a long complaint file and he pulls out a file. And I was like, where did you get that? Where did you get a file on the sheriff? I was like, well, bear in mind this is the 1950s, did you actually travel there? And then come back and go, yeah, apparently that place is a bit spooky. It's like, well, you were there, could you not have done your own research? What was that about? Anyway, Ardum was apparently settled around the same time all that shit was going on, but property records unavailable, the history is obscure, it's in the middle of nowhere, and there are no guide stops. So basically for our black characters, it is 100% danger zone. We get a nice little phone call here with George to Hippolyta and Dee, and I don't know how you felt about this, but I wrote in my notes, 100% foreshadowing the Hawkeye.
Yes, there was so much. It was heavy with foreshadow, so much so that I was surprised that he survived to the end of the episode.
Yeah, I was strong.
Was not surprised by the events of the second episode.
Well, here's the thing. I wrote Hawkeye because I was not 100% convinced they were going to go through with it. Because what I meant by that is Jeremy Renner's Hawkeye. There was, I forget which of the Avengers movies was it Age of Ultron, where they really foreshadowed his death, but then his death did not happen.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the vibe I was getting. So that's what I wrote in my notes. But we get the nice... I did like the way it was shot, though, because we do get the moment where Hippolyta presses the phone to her chest as if she is foreshadowing it. And we also get the detail here that Hippolyta is a stargazer. She's quite into astronomy. And that looks like it's going to be important later. And we also see at this moment that George has a picture of Tick's mother in his wallet. George, you dog, what is going on here? This next scene I did not like for a number of reasons. Not because it's a bad scene, but it left me unsettled in a way I just didn't particularly like. Marvin and Letty are having an argument while Tick and George are arguing about Tick's dad. And George saying, I always had to protect Montrose. And Tick said, well, you never protected me from him. It hits some moments for me because of my own personal family background, and it made me a bit uncomfortable. But doubly so, I did not like the fact that we hear Letty and Marvin arguing, and George, after having said all that shit about protecting people in your family, says, we can't intervene. And it's like, I'm hearing plate smash, dude. Yeah. George, what the fuck are you doing?
Why neither of them were straight in there.
Yeah, well, Tick goes to move in, and George talks him out of it, and it's like, what the fuck is going on here, man? It's like anything could be happening there. At least go in and make sure that, you know, Letty's not getting slapped about. Although, to be honest, two episodes later, I'm now thinking if anybody was getting slapped about, it'd probably be Marvin.
True that. But do you think maybe Tick was just conditioned to follow orders, having been in the military? So despite
That's
his
a good point.
heroic dash, he's immediately told not to, and it just boom, following orders.
That's a really good note, yeah. And we do, funnily enough, in this same scene, Tick does make reference to the fact that Montrose was not happy about the fact that his son joined the army in the first place, because he was very much in the kind of Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X mode of saying, really all you're doing is, as a person of colour, you get out to kill other people of colour for the white man. And then you're going to come back and you're going to encourage other black people to do the same thing. Which I did think was an interesting note. It's another little piece of the story that I do really like in this show. These are the things that are keeping me into it. We are still talking about the first episode, so this is largely positive so far. Stay tuned, guys. They try and find Devon County. I really dug this scene where they're kind of trying to find this bridge, and they cannot find the bridge. And Tick insists on pulling over. Letty gets out to help. They don't want to be out here after dark because this is a sundown town. Now, I don't know about you, how much stuff you've looked up about this show while it's been running online.
I looked up the definition of a sundown town.
Now, did you know what a sundown town was?
I didn't know before I watched it.
Right,
so,
okay.
In that sense, at least, it's been a worthwhile watch because it educated me about that, which I knew that, obviously, at the time, there was a lot of bad shit going on, but I didn't realise that it was basically legislated in certain areas.
I knew it was a thing because of other things I'd read. Like I'm quite sure James Baldwin references it in his oeuvre at some point. I'm sure other writers I've read have written about it. So I did have some awareness that it was a thing. But what struck me about this when I looked it up online, about the commentary about this episode, was the amount of American people who had no idea it was a thing. And I say American, I mean largely white Americans had no idea it was a thing. And that's because it's something that is not taught. And I realised that the same, in the same way that the Watchmen series taught a lot of white Americans about what happened in Tulsa.
I was going to bring that up as well, actually, because there was another incident that I had no idea. I had to Google it myself afterwards because I thought that was something that they'd fictionalised for the purposes of the show.
I think it's understandable for people in our part of the world to maybe not be aware of this stuff because, you know, it didn't happen here. It would not necessarily be the kind of thing we would learn about in school.
Yeah, you're not going to ask someone from New York to tell you how much they learned about the Highland clearances, for example.
Right, precisely, aye. So, but it's quite astonishing when you realise just how, I don't mean ignorant in the pejorative sense, I mean ignorant in its literal dictionary sense.
Yep.
Ignorant a lot of Americans are about this kind of history, but it's because the American education system is so riddled with white supremacy that these things do not get taught, and that is quite jaw-dropping to me. And it shouldn't be. I should be used to this shit by now, right? But every time I learn about something like this, about just how little awareness there is about this in American culture at large, I'm like, man, fucking hell. How is it the 21st century and this is still a thing? Anyway, they cannot find the bridge. I made a note here saying Bridge of Doon. That is a reference to Brigadoon. If you don't know what Brigadoon is, it is a Scottish reference. Google it, guys.
We've had a surprising number of Scottish references in this podcast so far, which is about a horror show set in America in 1950.
TLDR, Brigadoon is a Scottish town that both exists and does not exist.
It's Schrodinger's town, basically.
So anyway, the evil sheriff, aforementioned, turns up, gives them some hassle. Everything from here on in, man, for me this was the terrifying stuff.
Okay, let's talk about the world's slowest car chase.
Now this car chase is genius, but before we get to that though, I need to make mention of the fact Tick makes a joke about shoggoths. He says we can outrun a blob, but like he says George can't. And as soon as they say that, that's when the sheriff arrives in shot. And I thought it was a really nice choice by the director here. It might have been in the script to just have the sheriff appear right at that point. Because they're joking about Lovecraftian monsters. The real monster is right behind them. Although, of course, that will be undercut by actual monsters later. I thought that was a really nice touch. I really did. In the moment when I watched that scene, I was like, good one. I see what you've done there. So the sheriff comes up and says, you know what a sundown town is? This is a sundown county. And Atticus gets a bit lippy, says it's not sundown yet. There's still 7 minutes. I love that bit. I love the fact that Atticus is just standing up for himself. But you know instantly as soon as he says it that they are all in big fucking trouble. The sheriff says, it'll take you 7 minutes. Atticus says, we'll be out in 6. He says, if you speed, I'll have to pull you over. And he asks, is it legal to make a U-turn? And the sheriff says, ask nice. You know, he's deliberately goading and humiliating Atticus as much as possible. Says, forces him to ask, will you let this smart N-word make a U-turn? And I don't know about you, man, but my skin was crawling at that part in that scene, man. It was fucking horrible.
Everyone involved in that scene, though, played it so well.
Yeah, bringing their A-game.
It goes back to that idea of someone being able to inhabit the role of someone so despicable that it looks like they're relishing being that much of a scumbag. It's just
dumb scumbag. Yeah, it's pretty horrendous. So what ensues is you can describe it as a gripping race out of Devon County, with only 7 minutes left before sundown and the speed limit to abide by. But yeah, it is ingeniously the slowest car chase I think I've ever watched, and yet simultaneously one of the most gripping car chases I've ever seen. I thought this was hella clever because they are really flipping the convention of a high-speed car chase, and not in an arbitrary way, but in a way that makes 100% complete sense in the context of the scene and in the context of what these characters are dealing with in terms of where they find themselves geographically and historically. I thought this was an amazing scene, and it makes me a bit sad that the show since has not delivered anything on this level since.
Yeah, this is definitely the highlight for me of the show's ability to create a feeling of suspense and terror. Mm-hmm. Quite unlike anything I'd seen in TV for a long time. It was so gripping.
Same, yeah. I've definitely never seen this before. It delivers something I had not quite seen before. The only thing I think to compare it to is Speed.
Do you mean the Father Ted episode?
Careful now. Yeah, even the visual of the sun sinking, great use of lighting effects here. Some of it was probably digital, but it looked great. All of that stuff was so good. And the race up to the county line, and you know, I like the fact that they visualised the county line by having it level with a train track. The only thing that was missing here was a speeding train coming in at the last second, which part of me thought they were going to do that. But I did also think that would be slightly over-egging the pudding. But now that I've seen 2 further episodes of this show, I'm like, I cannot believe they actually had the restraint not to put a speeded train in there. But of course, just when they get across the county line, they think they're safe. They're not safe, because the sheriff has already called ahead to his buddies in the next county, and everything's fucked. Because what I liked about this, and this is what I've written in my notes, this is a nice callback to the Baldwin speech, because this really reflects Baldwin's comments about America being a different reality for black people, that no matter how fair you play the game, it has no meaning. The game board is always being rearranged against you. So they followed all the rules to get out of there, and it did not matter. And I thought that was a nice illustration of that idea. So anyway, these douchebag sheriff and his deputies take them into the woods, throw them on the ground, attempt to set them up for a bunch of local burglaries. Tick makes the mistake of addressing Sheriff Hunt by his name, and so Sheriff Hunt is like, well, you're not local, why do you know my name? And from there, we get the monsters.
We do.
How did you feel about the monsters?
I thought they were fun.
I thought they were really fun.
But they were not Lovecraftian monsters at all. And here is where I think I came to this show with a misconception about what it was about as well.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was part of the larger Cthulhu mythos, like the expanded universe, or at least would allude to that, but it doesn't at any point really do that. Instead, it's just schlock and monsters, which is great. Don't get me wrong, I love schlock and monsters. I love seeing racist sheriffs get eaten
100%.
by said monsters.
All day long.
But I would have liked an actual Shoggoth.
Right.
Call me old-fashioned.
Here's where I was when I watched this the first time round. I was like, okay, so this show is gonna shake it up with. It's going to have the creepy stuff, and it's also going to have the schlocky stuff, and it's going to be a nice back and forth. I was really excited about that idea. Unfortunately, it has weighed heavy on one particular swing of that pendulum and not bothered swinging back to the other one in the episode since, which, man, is really disappointing. But more on that later. But at this point, I was like, I am 100% into just the madcap nonsense of these monsters attacking. I'm like, cool, go for it. I think I was so high off the car chase scene that I was like, you know what, this show can do what it likes at this point. That scene was so good. I'm happy for this show to do what it wants.
There was something to be very Monsters Inc. about those monsters.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, it was full on schlock, and even in my high of watching that episode the first time, I wasn't under any illusions that it was anything but that. But I was quite happy for this show to kind of combine these things, to combine the different kinds of horror. I'm a fan of all different kinds of horror, but I did want more of the creep and less of the schlock.
I feel like the creators are probably fans of The Evil Dead.
I'm going to mention that later,
episodes.
actually. Yeah, I've got some Evil Dead things written in my notes here. Yeah, for sure. But yeah, no, I totally agree. And we see the first... in fact, I see where you're going now, because the first thing they do here is they run to that cabin in the woods.
Yep.
And lock themselves in there. Yeah, there are major Evil Dead vibes going on in that scene for sure. One thing I wrote here, which, and I know this was 100% unintentional on the show's part, but it did totally make me think of the way in which these black characters now are trapped inside this flimsy edifice with their racist white antagonists, and it sort of made my mind drift to the way in which there's the whole Black Lives Matter thing going on right now, whilst we are all essentially quarantined, and while white racism is at its most fucking virulent than it has been in such a long time. It struck me as a nice metaphor. Obviously unintentional, because this happened, this was all filmed pre-pandemic. They leave George behind. George is just left out there.
And the foreshadowing becomes just shadowing.
Absolutely. At that point, I'm like, okay, he's dead. But no, he survives. He survives because he has the torch. I like the way the Shoggoth eyes flicker out in response to the torch. I thought that was quite nicely done. So he makes his way to the cabin. Now, fucking Sheriff Hunt, man, this guy. This guy cannot die painfully enough. So Sheriff Hunt won't let Tick out in case he leads the monsters back. And Tick says, well, a gunshot will do the same thing, you fucking idiot. So they have the tussle to let George in. I do love the line here. I still love it even now. the fact that the sheriff is so insistent, says monsters don't exist, despite the fact they are being deluged by monsters. And I like that because it's a nice echo of the idea that for the black characters, monsters have always existed. So for them, this isn't that much of a stretch. They've always had to deal with monsters. And I thought that was quite a nice way to illustrate that. Again, I'm going to keep hammering on this. This is the stuff the show needs to be doing more of.
Do you know what I thought they were going to do? And I was pleasantly surprised that they didn't. I thought there was going to be they have to work together to fight the monsters, and through conflict against a more alien entity, the two would come together and solve the racial problem by fighting another race. And I was like, God, I hope they don't do that, because that's a bullshit message. And they didn't, and I'm so glad.
That did not occur to me, and I'm glad it did not occur to me.
I thought it was going to go full, like, fucking... Have you ever seen the Dennis Quaid movie, Enemy Mine?
Yes.
Right. I thought there was going to be, like, an Enemy Mine moment. I thought that trope was going to rear its fucking ugly head. Although Enemy Mine's a great fucking movie. I don't know what...
I've not seen it since the 80s, I have to admit.
Me neither, to be fair. It could be terrible, for all I remember.
George quotes Dracula here. I don't know that I liked it, but it was a way for the show to tell us that Dracula is George's favourite novel. But he realises the torch repels... Sorry, flashlight, if you're American, repels the quote-unquote vampires.
Is this what we call Draxposition?
Oh, buzzing. So, anyway, Sheriff refuses to let any of them go. Well, he refuses to let Atticus go in case he deserts them, so he insists Letty goes instead. Exposition here. I ran track in high school, says Letty. Yeah, thanks for that, Letty. We probably didn't need that, did we? I mean, people can... Some people can... Honestly, they could have not mentioned that, and I would totally accepted the fact that Letty can run fast. I don't mind.
I don't know, man. She had a real fucking busy schedule in high school. Between track, sci-fi club, and getting jiggy with that guy from the party in high school. Well, again, see, episode 3, sorry.
This is the kind of thing that really bothers me. Like, I don't know why the show goes out of its way to provide this kind of exposition. Do we really need an explanation for the fact that Letty can run quite fast? I mean, I don't care, frankly. There's nothing about the scene where Letty runs like fuck through the forest that would have had me thinking, hold on a sec, has she had some kind of track training?
Wait, I realise that she's terrified and running for her life from fucking, like, alien monsters, but do you think she'd be able to run that fast?
Yeah. It's stuff like this. Screenwriters, rein it in, stop doing it. Anyway, Journey Smollett giving her best Ellen Ripley here. I like how when she gets into Woody, which I don't know why. Is the car called Woody just because of the wood panels?
It could be, honestly, I don't know.
So Sheriff Hunt becomes a true monster, even though he was also a monster previous. Again, I did not like this exchange here between George and Atticus. What happens with a vampire bit? Yeah, no, we did not need that. But Atticus saying to the deputy, "You need to shoot him." I did quite like, yep. And the deputy just stand there going, completely useless, feckless in the face of danger. I like Letty using her camera as a weapon, and I did make a note here, which I don't think the show has really done anything with since, but it's just a brain fart on my part. I've written Letty and Tick both have lenses through which they view the world. Letty has a camera, Tick has his glasses. We see Letty use her camera as a weapon, but these are the things through which they perceive reality, and does that in some way affect how they view things? Does that somehow make them a bit more perceptive? We do see them being a bit more perceptive come episode 3 than just about anybody else around them, so maybe there is something in it, but I just thought it was an interesting note. So Letty crashes into the shack. George is unconscious. They repel the monsters. The beasts are called off. Now, I've made a note here. We hear the whistle. My note says, the beasts are called off by Carl Rod. And that is a reference to Twin Peaks The Return, and the character played by Harry Dean Stanton. If you don't know what we're talking about, look up Carl Rod whistle. There are variations of it on YouTube. All of them are funny. But that's where my mind immediately went when I heard that noise.
That whistle's got the sting of the 48-hour blend.
Well, by this point, when they're crawling through the woods, it's really late, or is it really early? So I've written here, Walk of Shame. They finally find the bridge of Ardham. It has revealed itself.
Still love it. Our Fire Walk With Me references.
Guys, if you like Fire Walk With Me and Twin Peaks references, stay tuned.
You're in for a treat in this podcast.
Right. Okay, so this is... I made a note here that Atticus's love of pulp stories of heroes that get to save the day, fight monsters, overcomes insurmountable odds, all of it being so far removed for black kids growing up on the south side of Chicago. Now it's all kind of up close, it's real, it's happening to them, and the journey's just beginning, with them coming out of the woods into a strange manor filled with fuck knows what. We see the flashy car there. You can tell by my notes, I was really excited at this point about where the show was going to go. Well, if you want to hear a man become less and less enthused as time goes on, stay tuned. But I have written here, they go up to the manor, they're greeted by Creswell. This motherfucker who plays the butler, that guy is Creswell. He says, "Welcome, Mr. Freeman, welcome home." And then we go into a burst of Sinner Man over the end credits. And I immediately asked the question, why, in the ever-loving fuck, did you not use Nina Simone's version?
Was there some sort of rights issue to use Nina Simone's version? It's not like it hasn't been used in movies and TV shows before.
No, it's been used multiple times. So what, you know? And this version is by Alice Smith. It's serviceable, but I guess what I don't like about it is it's literally just replicating Nina Simone's arrangement. And I don't understand the point in doing that. If you're going to use a version other than Nina Simone's, then use one that sounds different. If you're going to use one that's a pale copy of Nina Simone's, why did you do that?
Having said that, would I be more upset if they did the typical Hollywood slow-down angst version?
Yeah, maybe.
If there's like a halftime remix? That would be...
So that was episode 1, and I came off that episode on a high. I thought, this show is going to be decent. This show is going to do some interesting stuff. And using our Mr. Robot-themed scoring system, I would have scored this first episode 8.5 5s out of 9.
Well, if we're talking 5s out of 9, I would have scored it a 7.5 5s out of 9.
And before we go any further, we should explain that 5-9 is an important date in Mr. Robot. And James and I, if you have not gathered by now from our podcast title...
or from the previous episode.
Tune into our second episode. We're big Mr. Robot heads, so our scoring system is 5s out of 9.
And for any of our non-American listeners, which I assume is the lion's share, but you never know, in Mr. Robot 5-9, the date, of course, refers to the 9th of May, not the 5th of September.
Yes, not the 5th of September. Reclaim those dates, as Stuart Lee would say.
Yep, but we won't go off on Stuart Lee's... subsequent whole routine about that.
No, yep. It's just a joke, like on Top Gear. So, yeah, did you see 7.5?
7.5, 5s out of 9.
Interesting, okay. When this episode ended, what were your feelings about the show generally?
Do you mean what about the episode that I just watched, or what I thought it was
about where
going
you
to
thought
be?
the show was going to, where you thought the show was going to go based on this episode?
Well, I had read that it was an anthology show, technically.
Oh, interesting. It's not really.
And I assumed it would be more anthology-ish than it's turned out to be, but I was going to say, I would have, frankly, have settled in for a no supernatural elements whatsoever road trip. Like a historical period drama of that time with those characters, where I guess there's allusions to the idea of Lovecraftian horror and different horror tropes, but where it's obvious that, you know, the horror is in reality. The events and the legislation of that time is about as horrific as anything that the most warped horror writer mind could have come up with.
For sure, yep.
Or, alternatively, I would have just gone for like a totally fun Schlockathon. I'd be happy with that too.
Right, what I was going to say was, I think part of the problem is that the show can't quite make up its mind what it wants to be. In terms of where it's set and exactly what happens with the characters, it's all done in a very particular way, episode by episode. So this first episode was very much the road movie episode. The second one, I don't know what you would call it. It's like visiting the haunted manor type thing. The third episode is definitely a haunted house movie. Where it goes from there, I don't know. I think this is something that is working more against the show than in its favour, personally.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that if you're going to have an ongoing series, it should have a certain ongoing theme rather than jumping haphazardly from topic to topic as each episode goes on.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, how's our podcast going right now?
Moving on.
That was a self-referential joke. We need a self-referential joke class. We'll put one in there.
I kind of admire what they're trying to do with this show. Like, I think it's worth... You know what, man? We called our first episode quote-unquote experimental. And I think what this show is doing is quote-unquote experimental. They've got a noble goal and at least trying a slightly different approach to a full season of television, where it is telling a continuous story, but it's doing it in a very deliberately episodic fashion. And I think that's definitely worth exploring. It's definitely something that's worth doing. I just don't think that this particular narrative is the one to have done it with. Matt Ruff may have written a good novel that he was able to use that framework, but writing a novel in that framework is an entirely different game that you're playing than, you know, writing a 10-episode TV show. The rules are completely different. One of the problems I have with the show, and we're about to get into this as we get into the next 2 episodes, I feel like there is way too much information they are trying to get across to the viewer in one episode. And the reason it's so constricted is because at the same time, they're trying to do all this stylistic stuff because of this, these parameters that they've imposed on themselves. Like, they've said, well, this episode is this thing, so we can only do all of these things within the paradigms of this thing. So all of the information we get in episode 3, for example, and I won't talk about that just yet, but I will just say there's so much information delivered in that episode, but all of it is delivered so quickly, and there's so much of it, that there is no space for the idea of a haunted house episode to actually ever breathe. And that is, I think, this show's main failing. And for me, it's the thing I'm coming away feeling most frustrated about. Because there's great stuff in this show in terms of its ideas, in terms of where it seems to want to go aesthetically, for the most part. But the execution of it, progressively episode by episode now, I am enjoying the execution of it less and less.
So, shall we hit the bar and then reconvene to discuss the gradual sliding quality of Lovecraft Country as we enter episode 2?
I think it's my round. What are you drinking tonight, James?
Tonight, from the bar, I have a Beaujolais.
Sweet. How's it working out for you?
I'm on red wine tonight. It is good, actually. It's very nice.
Regular Gordon Cole over here.
Yep, I like a Beaujolais, I'm not going to lie. This is from a particular UK supermarket, but I'm not going to advertise it.
No, other supermarkets are available.
Only £5 a bottle.
Prestigious.
Prestigious as fuck. But very delicious, actually, for a £5 wine.
Well, there you go. I am drinking Camino del Ángel Malbec from
Nice.
Chile. It is going down a treat. For people who have listened to every episode of this podcast so far, all 3, and who are thinking to themselves, does Craig only drink wine from Latin America? The answer to that is, first of all, thank you for listening to every episode of the podcast. Second of all, what are you doing with your life? And third of all, yes.
This is the first episode we've recorded that I've not been drinking beer. That I've not been on the East Coast IPAs.
Well, I feel that deserves a celebration of its own. I always said one day you will be a real boy, and I feel we've arrived at that day.
A wee fruity French tonight.
You been listening to anything this week that's been particularly helpful in dealing with the shit show that is real life?
It's funny you ask that, because I've listened to some stuff and watched some stuff. Let me tell you about what I've been listening to, and let me inform our listeners of another podcast they might want to check out. If they feel like it. Or 2 podcasts, a brace of podcasts, if you will, to use the old English.
I believe that's what they would say in Bideford.
There was a point I wanted to make about that, actually, about the last witch trial. That was the last witch trial in England. The last witch trial in Scotland, however, was a much later date.
Yeah, it was, that's true.
And the last witch executed in Scotland is buried in my hometown, right here in Paisley.
Right,
There is a marker in the centre of a crossroads where the witch was buried.
What was the witch's name?
I don't know. I don't know much
damn
about
it. God damn it, James.
Fuck it, I'll look it up for next episode, right? But it's right there, it's a whole thing. Anyway, back on topic. The first podcast is a podcast that I'm glad that I didn't start listening to earlier. I'm glad I didn't discover this podcast, say, 8 to 12 weeks ago, because it would have been devastatingly depressing to listen to. But it's a podcast called The Fall of Civilizations. Very interesting historical podcast, just that follows the reasoning behind why great civilizations of history disappeared, what happened to them. The answer mostly is climate change and colonization.
Yeah, those are always surefire pop quiz answers to any of these such questions.
Yeah, you just insert why did X empire fall? Answer, Europeans and their fucking smallpox. That's why.
Yeah, pretty much.
But there was a lot of really interesting stuff in episode 5, I believe, about Easter Island. And the mistaken belief of why Easter Island had almost no trees on it, and the creation of the statues and stuff. It was really good.
Okay.
That was podcast number 1 I've been listening to. Podcast number 2 I just started listening to is called Wind of Change. And I don't know if you're familiar with the podcast Wind of Change.
I'm not, no.
Wind of Change is a podcast about a journalist for the New Yorker, among other things. Has a friend who worked for the CIA, and his friend who worked for the CIA had a friend who is not named in the show, who over drinks one night told him that the Scorpions song Wind of Change was written by the CIA as part of a culture war during the Cold War in order to bring down the Soviet Union.
Amazing.
And there's a whole podcast series about them trying to investigate how true this is.
That is incredible.
I just listened to episode 1 titled My Friend Michael, during which Patrick Radden Keefe explains the background of him hearing this story about the Scorpions. And it's also quite reassuring for me, Craig, because in it he first found out about this story in 2011, and he says it's taken me 9 years to actually put this into podcast form finally. So someone took longer to make a podcast from inception than we did. The whole thing, like I say, it's called Wind of Change. The whole thing is on Spotify. It's on Google Podcasts. It's on that place, all the places you can get your podcasts. Like I said, I'm 1 episode in so far, and it's absolutely brilliant. It's mind-blowing. It's funny. It's really interesting.
Okay, I will definitely check that out. It sounds worth a listen. I've not been listening to much of the weird podcasts. I've been trying to keep myself sane in this fucking fascism part 2, fucking Great Plague part 2, nightmare reality in which we all live, by listening to music that's kind of speaking to the moment and making me feel a bit more assured that maybe everything isn't completely fucked. It's sort of pointing the way towards at least some hint of a horizon that maybe humanity can make it over the hump, and there'll still be some form of life on this planet that won't be just a complete waste of time, and everything won't end in barbarism and horror.
I do love your optimism, Craig.
Yeah, well, it's not my optimism, man. This is why I have to look to other artists for it. No, I've been listening to a lot of Lonnie Hawley lately. Are you familiar with Lonnie Hawley?
I am not familiar with Lonnie Hawley. Please explain.
I will. Lonnie Hawley is a black American artist and musician. He works a lot of media. I'm mainly familiar with his music, but his music is amazing. It's like a combination of spoken word and poetry and jazz and blues and all kinds of very experimental, and not quote unquote experimental, but actual experimental kind of soundscapes. He's an amazing wordsmith. He writes a lot about race relations, but in a very kind of in the way that I was expressing earlier when we were talking about that first episode of Lovecraft Country, where how I appreciated the James Baldwin speech being inserted in a way that's sort of anachronistic. Lonnie Hawley has this way of just combining the totality of the African American experience and making it seem all present, all one. And he is a very zen kind of guy. Reading interviews with him, he approaches his work with that sort of framework in mind, where he views all of history as being part of the present moment, which, you know, I'm very much into that sort of philosophy, and it's very tuned into quantum physics, the way in which, you know, we as human beings only experience the passage of time, because that's the only way we can experience it, because we cannot actually occupy the fourth dimension as such. Lonnie Holly's very tuned into that, and so all of the kind of historical things he references, he's bringing them to the present. He's bringing history to meet the present, so they all exist, it all coexists. But he has an amazing voice, such a raw, kind of agonized voice that's simultaneously just so beautiful and transcendent, and man, everything he does is amazing. I cannot recommend it enough. Also been listening to a lot of Moor Mother this week for all of the same reasons.
Yep. Moor Mother's going to bring you that feeling you need.
100%. Yeah, I think she's probably the most relevant artist on the planet right now. Also been listening to Idris Akamura's latest album, Shaman. If you like your Afro-themed jazz records, which I know you're quite into, I recommend it. It's a very good record.
Nice one. Will you send me a link later?
I will send you a link later, I'll promise to, and you can always put in a funny Hamilton overdub of how I forgot because I was too high on Malbec.
Self-referential klaxon goes off at that point.
3 episodes in, we're into self-references. Yeah, we got this podcast game down pat, dude. This is how it's done.
Someone told me you needed catchphrases. So.
Well, it worked for Little Britain. Oh no.
Have you watched anything else other than Lovecraft Country that has sparked your interest in the last week or so?
I recently finished season 2 of Nosferatu or Nosferatu or however you pronounce the name of that show. NOS number 4, letter A number 2. Someone please tell me how you pronounce the title of that show. It is entertaining nonsense. I recommend it if you're into brainless entertaining nonsense that has Zachary Quinto chewing scenery like a boss, and I fucking love Zachary Quinto, so I'm all about that. I also finally, much delayed after your recommendation of a long time ago, I finally decided to pounce because it finally appeared on Netflix to get into the world of Cobra Kai, which I have to say is a show that is way better than it has any business being.
I know, right? It has... Before you watch it, it has little to nothing going for it.
Right, yep. I will say the first 5 to 10 minutes of the first episode, I was like, I don't know that I'm into this. Because I was like, here is the guy who played Johnny from the first Karate Kid for some reason, and he's anti-immigrant, and he's a bit of a douchebag. Why am I watching this? By the end of the first episode, I was like, this is actually alright. Before I knew it, I'd binged the entire first season. I was like, yep, day well spent.
Yep, it is weirdly whip smart and comical as hell. Just the right amount of cheese.
100%. Very entertaining, daft nonsense, which I guess at a particular point this week in the hell show in which we live was just what I needed.
Speaking as we are of Lovecraft Country, I caught the HP Lovecraft adaptation Colour Out of Space.
Oh shit, yeah, with Nicolas Cage. How was that?
I would give it 10 out of 10. I would give it 9. I would give it 9 5s out of 9.
Wow. Good shit.
Purely on ridiculous spectacle alone. Much like the complaints I have about Lovecraft Country, and we'll get into that when we return to our Lovecraft Country reviews shortly. It completely misses any marks of Lovecraftian horror in lieu of like just schlock and awe. And absolutely absurdly over-the-top performance by Nicolas Cage, even for Nicolas Cage.
Wow.
It's the Nicolas Cageiest Nicolas Cage performance I've seen in quite some time.
HP lol Cage.
Attempts to pick up certain elements of Lovecraft and just drops them really quickly. It doesn't really seem to give a fuck what it's doing at any point. It's hilarious, and yeah, it's worth a watch.
Sweet.
I've probably oversold it. Let me underline that by saying it's not a great film.
No, man,
thoroughly entertaining.
It's been on my radar since it was announced, and I'm 100% prepared for the schlock bullshit that it will no doubt be. I've been really digging Cage's output in the last couple of years. I feel like he's been on a bit of a renaissance, but I do realise it's a renaissance of complete fucking nonsense. I mean, the films he's been in are technically not that great, but I've sort of loved almost every one of them. I really dug Mandy. I really dug Mom and Dad. He's back to being classic Cage. I am into it.
He is. What did he claim he wanted to be? The American Klaus Kinski?
Probably job done by this point.
Yeah, I think he succeeded.
Alright, on that note, shall we dive back into Lovecraft Country episode 2?
Yep. I hope you've got your skis on, my friend, because we're about to rapidly go downhill.
I'm not as harsh on it as you are, but I
Good
do
point,
nonetheless concur with that sentiment.
I feel like I should foreshadow this second section talking about it by saying I'm probably going to step back. I know I didn't say much about the first episode, but I'm probably going to step back even more because I don't have a good word to say about episode 2.
Alright, well, with that challenge, we'll see how we go.
Okay.
Lovecraft Country episode 2, it was called Whitey's on the Moon, which when I saw the title I was like, oh cool, that's a Gil Scott-Heron reference, and they actually do have the Gil Scott-Heron track towards the end of the show, which if I'd read that and known that was coming I would have said, oh that sounds cool, but then when I saw the scene itself I was like, not so much. Anyway, once again, written by Misha Green, directed by Daniel Sackheim. Daniel Sackheim directed the next 2 episodes, and Daniel Sackheim is probably the hardest working director in American television because he has literally worked on every television show.
Is he a harder working television director than Jennifer Lynch?
Harder working, yes. Let's leave it at that. Alright, so the opening of this episode, we get a bit of a montage. We get Letty and George kind of living it up in the manor. We get moving on up playing. Now I will admit I liked the jarring nature of the way this episode started. I was like, okay, I know what the fuck is going on here. George and Letty seem very excited. Letty's getting all dressed up, and can we just say, some pretty fucking fabulous clothes, by the way. George is super excited about his books. As someone who owns a lot of books and has a major fetish for my own bookcases, I appreciated this shit. I was all over this scene. I quite liked this. This gave me hope that this would be a good episode. Narrator's voice, reader, this was not a good episode. So all of the books and all the clothes seem eerily suited to both George and Letty, almost as if they were tailored towards them. Spooky, huh? Meanwhile, Tick is sitting in his room. He's looking a bit sullen, a bit kind of, I'm not digging this type shit. I've written here, and I don't know if you got this, but Tick is sitting there in a yellow shirt, and I wrote, Major Luke Cage vibes. I thought he was looking hella Luke Cage in this episode. Creswell from episode 1 introduces himself as William. He says he's a close personal friend of Christina, and Christina, it turns out, is the actual white saviour woman from episode 1.
With Christ in her name and everything.
Yeah, see what they've done there. Anyway, things we quickly learn. There's no phone at this place because, of course, why would there be? The owner of the lodge, as it's called, is a man named Samuel Braithwaite. Now, I have written many notes here. I was like, wait, do they mean Braithwaite, question mark? No, they actually said Braithwaite. I've written further down as they've said the name again. And I've written here, could they hammer home any further that this is a white supremacist? I guess not. So it's Samuel Braithwaite. Y'all got that? You're going to be hearing that a lot more as it goes on, with the second syllable really emphasised. Braithwaite. You got that, guys? Have we got that message across? Okay, good. Glad you're still with us. Okay, so they have a breakfast prepared for them. I'm quite enjoying Letty's attitude at the breakfast table. She's all about just eating this shit up and getting whatever she can. Creswell tells them that Samuel Braithwaite built this lodge so they could dine in private for him and his extra special guests. They ask, what was Samuel Braithwaite's business? He says shipping. I do like Letty's aside here. Yeah, that's code for slavery.
Yep.
We learn that there was a great fire in the lodge in is it 1853? And the original architect of this place was a man named Titus Braithwaite, who died along with pretty much everyone, apart from, it seems, the perpetrator, who we later learn was a slave woman named Hannah. Letty rings a bell for service. I did do a massive lol at that bit. She says, there's a war on spice. These white people don't put spices on their food. I enjoyed that shit. I thought that was quite funny. I did quite enjoy this exchange here where Letty says, you shot the sheriff. And he says, I had to shoot the sheriff. There's a nice little reference there. So the car is magically fixed. Tick is acting all out of sorts because he realises that George and Letty cannot remember anything that occurred the previous night with the monsters. Now, it's this point I did start to get a bit of a sinking feeling, because like, this is too much of a trope and I don't know if I dig it really. I don't know why there's any need for Letty and George not to remember this stuff. And even after the supposed justification for it later in the episode, I'm still like, I don't think that needed to happen. But George says that he's worried that Tick might have shell shock from his experience on the battlefield in Korea, which I did think was quite an interesting detail. We get the whistle, the same whistle that we heard earlier, the Carl Rod whistle, as I'm calling it from here on in. So they follow the sound of the whistle and they go to meet this. I did not catch this character's name, so there's this woman who is clearly way lower down in the social ranks, but it seems to be her job to guard this tower, where we do later learn that Montrose has been kept prisoner.
Now, I believe her name is Randall McHenchperson.
Yep, that sounds legit. But she has some quite heavy-handed dialogue here, making metaphors between black people and bears, because George asks her, do you get grizzlies around here? And she says, no, just the blacks. Meaning black bears, but with the obvious inference. She says the blacks are bad enough, smart enough to cause mischief. And it's at this point I'm like, I don't know that there's so much need for all this dialogue. Some of this is a bit, I get that these characters are white supremacists. I think we've got that. This is in case you missed the point that Samuel Braithwaite is a white supremacist.
I found it pretty heavy-handed that they were so like, white, and the blacks, and white, and I was like, okay, right. But then I was like, is this white guilt? Is my white guilt coming out a little here? Am I starting to think maybe you're overdoing it a little bit? But I've read several different reviews by people of colour who also are like, the white supremacy is kind of heavy-handed, but my white guilt was doing fucking backflips at this point.
No, I totally get it, and I think I had those same misgivings as well. I will say, by episode 3, I had lost that, because I was like, no, no, I was right to have misgivings about this. So they speculate that this tower is a dungeon, and so they're thinking this is where Montrose has been held, and it will turn out that they are absolutely right about this. Randall McHenchperson kind of ousts them from the place. They're walking back through the woods. We once again hear the Carl Rod whistle.
Shelley, what the hell? Are you okay, sweetheart?
Can you give me a ride to the Double R, Carl?
While they're walking through the woods, George suddenly and inexplicably remembers a detail about Tick's mother, where he starts to talk about, oh yeah, you're, I think it says Tick's great-great-grandmother. He starts to mention it's called Hannah, was a slave. He's a bit sketchy on the details. And then, conveniently, they're attacked by the monsters. So we get the Shoggoths again, and then once again, we get the Carl Rod whistle.
Can you give me a ride to the Double R, Carl?
Christina appears, calls off the monsters. Letty and George immediately forget everything again. And it's at this point I've written in my notes, why? Question mark. And even now looking back, I still don't understand why. Anyway, we then move to a scene where we're introduced to Samuel Braithwaite as he's having what looks like part of his liver removed. George, meanwhile, is venturing back into his room with all the bookshelves, and he notices a copy of House on the Borderland, which is an actual book written by William Hope Hodgson, who is a British writer of whom HP Lovecraft was a huge admirer. And The House on the Borderland is essentially a story about a haunted house. A later edition of that book was actually published by Arkham House, so Lovecraft was a big enough fan that he wanted to make sure that more people read it. So it clearly had a massive influence on him. So it's an opposite choice. But for whatever reason, George decides he's going to pull that book off the shelf, and it magically opens a secret passageway. And it's this point I was like, I have written here, Scooby-Doo. We are now entered the Scooby-Doo portion of Lovecraft Country.
Jeepers! Jinkies!
So George goes through the secret passage. While he's investigating that, Tick is introduced to Samuel. They have something of a conversation. Samuel makes the comment, "You're darker than I expected," which is an interesting line because it's the first intimation that we get that Samuel and Atticus are in fact blood related. But I think there's also an underlying thing with dark in the sense of sinister, how sinister do we think Atticus might get in this show? Because there are moments we've seen a dark edge to him, and there is also this lingering mystery about what happened in Korea. So I wonder if maybe that was also a little signpost there. I guess we'll find out as the episodes go on. You might not, James. I don't know if you're bailing out or not.
Oh no, I'm sticking with it. But I'm not as confident as you are that was a double-edged meaning. I think that was just...
You think?
I think that was just some less than subtle writing.
We see the painting here in this room where Samuel has been operated on, and it's a scene of Genesis. Samuel goes on to explain what this painting represents, and it's how at this point in the Garden of Eden, everything was in its right place as Samuel sees it. And the way Samuel interprets this part of the Bible is that essentially there was a natural hierarchy and that white men were at the top. That is basically what he's saying. Now, if he knows anything about archaeology and about the history of human genetics, he must know that can't possibly be true, because black people definitely came before white people. But whatever, dude, whatever. As far as he's concerned, there's a natural hierarchy, and someone like Atticus is way down the line. And as we learn later in the episode, the only thing that makes Atticus valuable is the fact that he is related to this white bloodline. So Samuel does have this very flowery speech. All of this is very pompous, and I guess it's supposed to be pompous. I mean, Samuel Braith, white, is definitely not meant to be a likeable character. I don't know about you, but I was expecting Samuel to be more of a big bad for the rest of the season at this point.
The way he was built up and talked about and introduced, I thought he was going to be, if not the BBEG, then at least one of them. For those of you who don't know, BBEG is a Dungeons & Dragons term which means big bad evil guy, usually referring to the villain of an overarching adventure.
First of all, gay. Second of all, stupid.
So Samuel basically says that everything was in its right place at this point in the Garden of Eden.
Yeah, like fucking way to go, Tom York. It's a Radiohead joke. There's not going to be many of those.
Please, no more Radiohead references. Samuel says that Eve is the one who brought entropy and death. And Samuel is kind of suggesting that the patriarchy is in the natural state of things, which I guess for a lot of very patriarchal male Christian zealots is pretty much how they read the Bible. And certainly the Bible has been interpreted that way. What this show is doing is presenting a very extreme version of that. But I guess it is commenting on the fact that the Bible, this interpretation of the Garden of Eden and how Eve's kind of temptation is pretty much why men are the ones who have to be in charge and women have to be kept under control, basically. And you do find this trend in all of the Abrahamic religions, certainly, and certainly throughout a lot of monotheistic religions. What I find interesting about this, though, is that I don't know if I've seen too many examples of Eve being credited with giving birth to entropy, because I've always thought of that as being a very male thing. Now, you've read Redshift over Badtown, James.
Yep.
Plug Klaxon.
Available now from wherever good books are sold.
I and certainly many other writers have gotten a lot of mileage out of the idea that entropy and the way in which time is measured are intricately tied together, and that these are in fact very patriarchal ideas, because these are essentially what all hierarchies are based on. As you know, everyone has to surrender their time to authority in a way. And I don't want to get too much into this, but I did just think there was an interesting point that this show seems to be flipping that slightly and saying that it's the feminine that's associated with entropy and associated with the linearity of time. I don't think I've ever seen that done, or I've certainly not seen it done very often. I mean, usually it's suggested that women are more in tune, the feminine side is more in tune with the anti-linear kind of side of things, and the linear side of things is always seen as the good side. But what Samuel seems to be saying here is that the hierarchy can somehow exist in a state where it is just perpetual. Yeah, to me that makes no sense, and I was having a hard time really getting on board with what the fuck Samuel was trying to say. I mean, I know what he's trying to say. I just don't think that it does not make sense to me, because for a hierarchy to exist, it needs time to exist. It needs a linearity to exist. Otherwise, there's no vehicle with which that patriarchy, that hierarchy, can perpetuate itself, if you see what I mean. Now, to the writer's credit here, The character of Christina is vocally skeptical about this. And she's clearly here as the female voice to say, well, you know, why the fuck is my gender being picked on here? Why is it Eve's fault? Why can't it be read that it was Adam that fucked up? And we get this sense of the privileged underdog from Christina, that even though she's part of this privileged class, she will never be a part of the upper echelon purely because she's a woman. Now, after episode 3, I am way less enthusiastic, or way less, certainly slightly less willing to believe that the writers have all this in mind. Maybe they still do, and maybe they're just playing a long game. I don't know. Christina does have one of my favourite lines here, when Atticus suggests that, so what, you're in league with the clan and whatnot, and Christina says, no, the clan are too poor. Which I don't think that needs any further commentary. Okay, so now we come to this part, the part of the episode where from this point on, Christina comes out and admit, in fact, no, Tick challenges her and says, basically, not in these words, but he basically says, I know you've put a spell on Letty and George, cut that shit out kind of thing. And it's at this point I'm like, is this Harry Potter? What is that? Why are we talking about spells suddenly? And why is that a thing that Atticus is just suddenly really comfortable talking about? Like, what the fuck is going on, man? And I've actually written in my notes, what the fuck is going on?
The casual introduction of that language is a bit fucking jarring.
It was severely jarring, and I was like, hold on a second, man. What is going on? Why are we talking about spells suddenly? And Christina basically just... not in these exact words, but she essentially just says, yeah, I put a spell on them, but it's fine, alright, if you want it removed, I'll remove it. Okay, so we're now in a universe where you can cast spells and just remove them willy-nilly, and what I have a problem with this kind of thing is that immediately says to me, okay, you've just removed a big portion of the stakes in this story, because now you're telling me that people can just do things magically. And that's automatically it gives me a sinking feeling, because I'm thinking, I don't know what I can have faith in this story from this point on. And this is why I have a problem whenever this kind of thing is just suddenly introduced in a story. I don't know how you feel about that. How do you feel?
As you know, I'm fond of your sort of nerdier side of like the quote-unquote fantasy and supernatural stories and drama and whatnot. And any reader of like Lovecraft stories, given the Lovecraft connection to this show, will know that a lot of it is based around the idea of these like wizards and cultists and madmen who cast these spells. So to have the word spells come up in a show like that isn't unexpected. Mm-hmm. So I didn't find that too off-putting, the way like that word and being used, but the way it was introduced so casually and no one seemed to go, wait, what the fuck? Magic? Right, yep. Because the other thing is, in Lovecraft's world, magic takes a fucking... If you cast a spell, it fucks you, you know?
Yes, right,
it's like
exactly.
Power for power. There was none of that. There was like, shrug. It's a magic spell. And again, this is me maybe putting too much of a... I thought this was going to be an HP Lovecraft TV show into it. Mm-hmm. But you're right, the way this comes in here, it knocks the rest of the episode out of whack. It just sends it off into a spin, which is why my 3-word review of this episode, even though we're not finished yet, was a disjointed mess.
Yeah, I at this point, I did start to think, I don't know that this is going in a direction that I'm particularly going to enjoy. Yeah, as you say, it was the way it was introduced. I just didn't dig it. It really felt like a jarring moment to me. But that is kind of the track that this Lovecraft Country train has been riding since. So I guess it is what it is, man. The executive producers on the show are J.J. Abrams and Jordan Peele. One of those two, his work I generally enjoy, the other not so much. Now, the thing is, though, here's the thing, like, executive producer credits carry too much weight in our culture. I've seen so many people online saying, oh, great, Jordan Peele, I love him. It's like, Jordan Peele did not make this show, guys. He's the executive producer. Executive producer credit literally means, okay, I got some money together to get this done, and now I've got some people to make this show. Enjoy. And it's like, he didn't actually have anything to do with the making of this show. J.J. Abrams is even more meaningless. Is there anything that's not executive produced by J.J. Abrams? I'm sure if you cut my fucking genes down, right down to the foundation of my DNA, it'd probably say imprinted somewhere, executive produced by J.J. Abrams. Like, you cannot escape J.J. Abrams by this point. Anyway, so the other two are now trapped in the rooms for some reason. I couldn't quite understand.
It's spells, Craig. That's what it is.
Hashtag spells. Letty is trapped in her room, can't get out. Tick appears. We will soon learn that it's not really Tick, that it's some kind of illusion. Letty starts reciting a prayer, which I thought was interesting because we know her church days are behind her, and I guess this is maybe some kind of homage to Matt Ruff's book, in which she supposedly is a lot more religious. When she's speaking to this non-Tick, she tells this story about how she was left alone for a week when her mother left the house and didn't come back, and she was terrified for a week. I thought this was a nice moment, nice character moment from Letty. Again, it might be something that comes back. But Tick tells her, I'm never going to abandon you, and that seems to incite some passion between them. We get the shot of the weird stained glass window where Adam has a snake cock. Now, I've written here in my notes, does that mean it was Adam's fault? As in the fall of Eden? I feel like there are confused messages that the show is putting across here. Anyway, it's not really Tick. All of this is an illusion. George is having his own illusion where Tick's mother, Dora, appears to him, and they have this conversation. And George appears entirely aware that this is an illusion, which I thought was interesting. He's the only one of the three that seems aware that the illusion is an illusion, and he seems willing to go with it. I'm interested to see where they go with the link between George and Dora, because I thought that was an interesting thing about George, that he knew this was not real, but he was happy to indulge in it, and yet we know he's a happily married man with Hippolyta. I don't know, I just thought it was a bit... It's worth noting. Tick, meanwhile, is attacked by Jamie Chung. So she appears again. This time, notably, she's in military uniform. So that makes me think, was she an enemy combatant in Korea? Or was she, was she on the Allied side? I guess that's a mystery. I don't know yet. I mean, maybe some expert there will probably be able to tell the difference between the uniforms. But he kills her in his illusion, and it starts to make me think: is he guilty of some act of violence against this woman? Is that what we're going to find out? Because that would be a pretty dark twist, man. But yeah, we just don't have enough to go on just yet. Now, I will say, as much as there are things about this episode I do not like, I was relieved when it turned out not to be the rest of the episode. Because I have watched so many TV shows in which this fucking trope of the protagonists are trapped inside an illusion conjured by the villain for an entire episode. That trope needs to die forever. I hate that shit. Okay, so meanwhile, back in Letty's room, things are getting a bit steamy. It looks like we're going to have a love scene here. Letty then starts seeming like she wants to back out. Tick, who's not really Tick, presses on, unzips his pants, and lo and behold, I've written here, Tim Burton's Edward Slitherwang.
That's getting a canned laughter for sure. I think I watched this episode with Sarah, and I think I just laughed and turned to her and just went, snake dick.
Yeah, that was an eye-opener. Yeah. So, anyway, to cut a long story short, all these illusions come to an end. I mean, I cannot even be bothered going through the descriptions of how they come to an end. You know how this goes. It's a trope that's the worst trope. I hate it so much. I do not want to ever see this in a show ever again. We get the dinner bell. All of them come out of their rooms. Oh, I should say, I forgot to mention, while all this is happening, we do see all of the sons of Adam are gathered. By the way, Sons of Adam are the acolytes of Samuel Braithwaite, and they're all gathered watching through these kind of portal windows where they see all of this taking place, which I thought was quite a nice kind of commentary in the way in which black trauma is kind of treated as a spectacle in our culture. I did appreciate that, and I feel like that's probably what that was going for. But again, there are many examples of this kind of thing in this show where I feel like that's a nice metaphor that I wish was in a different show. Okay, so they all come out of their rooms at the sound of the dinner bell. George asks Tick, what did they make you see? Tick is a bit cagey, and he goes to, as if to confess something happened in the war. And George has this line where he says, whatever happened, you were a good boy and you're an even better man. Which I thought was interesting, because it made me think of the way in which whenever a black victim of police violence, for example, is reported about, we always get these backstories about how they were not an angel. You know, it's just white supremacist media in action. And it did make me think that maybe that was a metaphor for that kind of thing. I thought that was quite interesting. What did you think?
I'd tuned out the fucking episode by this point. I was reading Twitter.
Fair enough. Well, I'll zoom through it then. George says they wanted to make us scared, which I feel is also a commentary on that same thing, the way in which culture wants people of colour just to remain scared and remain quiet. These are the things I like about this show. This is why I'm still tuned into it. I like these little touches. So George and Tick are invited to the dinner of the Sons of Adam, where they serve up pieces of what I think is Samuel's liver. And because of what George has seen through the passageway, he very, very conveniently found the inner sanctum of the Sons of Adam, which, you know, that's bad writing, man. But anyway, I did quite enjoy Georgie's speech where he goes off on one about how he is part of the Prince Hall Freemasons, and that's a real organisation, and it's like a spin-off of the actual Freemasons. There were certain chapters that would not allow black men into the Freemasons, and it's quite an interesting history. It's worth looking up, but that's what he's referencing there. But George is aware of a lot of the traditions of this kind of thing, and that's why he's tuned in to a lot of this kind of the way in which they conduct these ceremonies. And I do think it's quite interesting that the Sons of Adam, a lot of their customs are just bastardized off of the Freemasons, it seems like. So we do learn that Tick is a direct descendant of Titus Braithwaite, if that was not in any doubt previously. Atticus may be the last blood heir. Atticus then tries to take charge. Since I am the last blood heir, I want you all to get out except Samuel, and that's an order. So they all reluctantly leave. Sorry, they have this confrontation with Samuel, and Samuel says to Atticus, you're useful to us at the moment, but do not mistake useful for indispensable. This is another little touch I like, a little metaphor that in the way in which we, as a culture, consume black culture, for example, and you know how it's necessary to our culture, but it's also dispensable. We treat it as if it's dispensable because the people who create that culture, white supremacy does not care about. And I feel like I feel like that was quite a nice little comment on that. But we are getting into the dregs of this episode, unfortunately. So they go back to the dungeon where they find Montrose's flask. Letty takes out Randall McHenchman. It was not as fun as it should have been. I would have liked to have seen more ass kicking there.
It would have been nice if there was like a proper action movie fight scene just to lift everyone's spirits at this point in the episode. Yeah. And also, I mean, have you seen Birds of Prey, the movie?
I have not, but I've heard she's great in it.
She is fantastic in it. She's one of the high points. Honestly, I actually really liked that movie. I thought it was one of DC's better cinematic offerings. But Journey Smollett kicks some serious ass in it, and I just wanted to see her go full Black Canary at this point in the episode. So
I've written here, Montrose does a classic Shawshank. He Shawshanks his way out of the dungeon, and this is where I get it calls back to the Count of Monte Cristo. I did not expect to get the call back this soon in the story, I have to say. I thought this was going to play out a wee bit longer, but oh well, it is what it is. So when they confront Montrose, the gang, they say, we're here to save you, and he's all like, why the fuck did you come? Now at this point, things lifted slightly for me just because Michael K. Williams is on screen, and I fucking love that guy. And I'm so happy he's back on my TV screen. At this point, I've even written in my notes, MKW, yay. They attempt to escape in Woody. We get a telekinetic force field preventing them from doing so.
Classic.
Samuel follows them with Christina. Here is the part of the episode where it all falls down, man. Samuel shoots Letty. He then shoots George. Letty appears to die. Segue to the next scene. Christina is explaining to Atticus, Letty will be fine. If you do the ritual, George will also be fine. And the reason I'm sounding so despondent, listeners, is because at this point I'm thinking, so we're just killing people, bringing them back to life. Where are the stakes in this story anymore? If anyone dies in this show from here on in, how do I know they're even dead? And I hate this kind of thing. I really cannot stand it. And it would be fine if there was some kind of background to this where we kind of understood the ins and outs of why this happened, how it happened, what the rules were. None of that is offered to us here. It literally is just, oh, we did a spell and now she's back. And I'm like, no, man, is this Sabrina the Teenage Witch? Get the fuck out of here, man. This is nonsense. This is not what I wanted from this show. And it's not what I want from any show, really. And I felt angry at this scene. I felt angry they'd killed Journey Smollett's character in front of me, only to just very cheaply bring her back in the next scene. I was like, no, fuck you guys. This is bullshit. And I also feel like it's a little bit of a cheat of the whole criticism of the way in which black trauma is a spectacle. Because what have you just done but traumatized us with Journey Smollett's death and then brought her back immediately? Fuck you guys. This is horrible. Why did you do that to me? And even now, having another episode further along, I just still don't understand why they did it. It was completely unnecessary. Now, granted, we do get Georgie's death at the end of this episode, but we knew that was coming because of the hashtag Hawkeye foreshadowing from episode 1. So I do not feel that they covered their ass on this at all. I feel this was bad writing, and I think it's unforgivable. Anyone who liked this, I'm sorry. This kind of thing really grates on me. I hate this kind of thing. It makes me lose faith in the writers completely. I felt massively cheated by this. And it just makes me think, this is the second episode out of 10. We've got 8 more hours. And you've already told me I cannot trust the writers. It does not instill confidence. So at this point, yeah, I really felt depressed in my attitude towards this show. On the upside, we do then get the ritual scene, which is good only for the fact that it has the Gil Scott-Heron track. And it's used interestingly here, admittedly. The fact that, because Gil Scott-Heron is essentially talking about the way in which the United States can afford, quote-unquote, afford to spend on luxuries like space exploration because it has so much money, because it has not spent that money on helping its minorities, helping the poor. And I thought the way in which that was symbolically represented here by Tick actually essentially quasi-sacrificing himself for this ritual, for these white supremacist douchebags, was certainly an interesting idea, at least. That said, there are things about this scene that are fucking terrible. The effects, for one thing, are not good. Mm-hmm. This is some of the worst digital effects I have seen in anything for a long time. The only thing I think I've seen in recent years that I thought was worse, and which I immediately forgave because of the context, was Twin Peaks The Return. And that's because Twin Peaks The Return exists in its own universe where it does not matter if effects look shit. Yeah. This, though, yeah, the effects really, really fell down, man. I really thought they looked pretty bad. Interesting to note here, though, that Christina gives Atticus the ring. It says, I will never earn one of these because I'm a woman. I can never enter that kind of echelon. And it did make me think, did Christina deliberately sabotage this ritual? Anyway, long story short, we get visuals of what appears to be Atticus's ancestor, Hannah. And through this visual, I guess we interpret that she was the one who was responsible for the lodge burning, in case we had not already gathered that. And we get the montage of her escaping from the burning lodge, and in real time, the lodge in quote-unquote present day, 1955, collapses. And all of the sons of Adam turn to dust and or stone in a really quite comical way, which shouldn't be comical. I will say, one thing I do like about this, and I forgot to mention this earlier, when Samuel is talking about Hannah earlier in the story, excuse me, not Samuel, I think it's Creswell brings it up. I'm just calling him Creswell, by the way. I don't give a fuck what his name is. He's Creswell to me. He says that Titus Braithwaite was known for his kindness, his generosity towards the slaves. And as soon as he said that, I was like, oh, he means he rapes the slaves. And I like that the show did not come out and spell that out. It just gave us the image of pregnant Hannah. I appreciated that, at least. I thought that was one of the few subtle things this episode did that I was like, okay, that was the right choice. I'm glad you chose to go in that direction. I'm going to segue off slightly here. This relates highly to Codex Witherspoon's. I don't know, and I've sent you some stuff, James. I don't know how much of it you've read, but there is a character in there for whom this background is very similar to their background. And so when I watched this, maybe that's one of the reasons why I was more... It's possible I'm more forgiven of the bad things about this than I otherwise would be, because I'm like, oh yeah, no, I totally dig this story, because that's kind of very similar to something I was doing in Codex Witherspoon's, which is a novel that may never be fucking published, because I may never finish it, but never mind.
Available wherever good books will be sold in the future.
In the future, if we have a future, guys. But yeah. Listen, plenty of people are digging this show, and I do not want to rain on their parade or piss on their cornflakes.
Are we in the minority here? In terms of enjoying
maybe,
the show?
I feel like maybe, yeah.
I don't mean to try and claim us as some sort of minority, incidentally. I'm just saying.
I also don't want to characterize myself as someone who is hating the show, because I'm not hating the show. I'm disappointed in the show, and I'm very frustrated by it. But there are things I love about it. I'm going to say more about this on my closing statement, so I'll save this for then.
Okay.
But these final scenes in this final episode, put it this way. I wrote in my notes, block capitals towards the end of this episode, I wrote, Sabrina! Because it was giving me heavy Sabrina vibes. Now, have you watched Chilling
Adventures of Sabrina?
I
have.
Watched that?
And I fucking loved it. I thought it was great.
Right. It's not bad, right?
It's nonsense, though.
But it's not what I wanted from this show.
Yeah. It's its own
show. And this show is the closing minutes of this episode are fucking Chilling Adventures of Sabrina.
Yeah.
I was like, that's not what I wanted from this show. I mean, even all the imagery of the sons of Adam and the robes and whatnot. I feel like I've seen this kind of thing so many times, and it was doing nothing new, and it wasn't even doing it in a particularly interesting way visually. And the whole spectacle of the lodge collapsing, I just was just like, nah, I'm not feeling this. Do you know what? Also, actually, what would have been more affecting was if the lodge had not collapsed, if it had just been left empty and desolate, and maybe the cult members had disappeared. Something like that would have been spookier.
Something mysterious.
Our gang escape, except for George, who does indeed die, because apparently, well, we know that Samuel dies before he has a chance to do a spell to resurrect George, so George dies. The end. I left this episode feeling very underwhelmed.
My whelm was nowhere to be seen at the end of this episode.
And again, still stuff I love about this, but I realise, and I realise this now more as I'm talking about it than I did while writing these notes or watching the episode itself, because I realise now, as I hear my voice saying it, about the things I did like, about just how desperate I am to find good things about this episode. Because I'm realising now it's more me reading into possible metaphors for what's happening in each scene, and not about things that are actually happening on screen.
In defence of the episode, I will say, isn't that what good art and good television is supposed to be anyway, is that it makes you draw your own conclusions as to what happened?
You could make that case, but I personally feel that's a very weak case.
I mean, I couldn't make the case, man. I thought that episode was bullshit. But
well, let's bring it back to something in our pantheon. You could say that same thing about Twin Peaks: The Return. There is not really a boring moment in Twin Peaks: The Return. I know some people say they were bored, but that's because they were watching it episode on episode and they got maybe a bit frustrated with some of the Dougie stuff or whatever. Non-Twin Peaks fans have no idea what we're talking about right now. Visually, in terms of Lynch's filmmaking, that guy knows how to make things look and sound and feel enthralling. So even if you're frustrated as fuck, you're still like, but I still can't turn away. Whereas with this, I'm like, I just feel like I've seen this kind of thing so many times before. And the only thing I'm still engaged with is the subtext. And that's not a good thing.
Before we go to the bar, the question is, how many 5s out of 9 would you give Whitey's on the Moon?
I am giving Whitey's on the Moon 5.5 5s out of 9.
Whitey's on the Moon gets 4 5s out of 9 from me.
It's not a good score, man. It's not a good score. Surely things can only go up from here.
Sounds like this show is going to take a turn for the better when we return from the bar, for sure.
I have full confidence that is the case, and I will not be disappointed.
We'll be right back after this short message.
You know what, man? The last time we recorded an episode, since then it's been a week of... We lost Chadwick Boseman, RIP Black Panther. We had some fascist fucking nutcase kill protesters on the streets in Wisconsin. We've had the President of the United States defend said fucking fascist nutcase. We've had our own Prime Minister over here saying that we should not be ashamed of celebrating the British Empire. Most summers, how they go by so quickly, and you're really gutted that the summer went by so quickly. I feel like this summer has lasted forever, man. It's like it just never seems to end. It's only early September right now. What the fuck, man? I feel like it should be 2023 by now. I feel like I've lived through 6 summers, as Anderson .Paak would sing. I feel like we're almost about to get out of it, but something keeps pulling us back, as Her would sing. James, is this an episode of F sub R&B?
I think it is. Cue the music.
Welcome to F sub R&B, where we just randomly segue off about talking about R&B and soul music, generally speaking.
Hey, tell us about that exciting artist Her that I believe the other podcast referenced a matter of seconds ago.
Well, Her is an amazing artist. She's a Grammy winner, and that should not attract you to her because the Grammys mean nothing. But Her is amazing. I love Her. Do you like Her, James?
I'm not familiar with Her.
I'm glad we came into this segue then. Her is an amazing artist. You know how we were talking in a previous episode about how Janelle Monáe was kind of a modern day Prince?
Yes.
In actual fact, Her is the modern day Prince.
Oh.
She does not have the funk of Prince, but she has more soul than Prince ever had. And she's equally as talented as Prince. She does not know how to write a bad song, and she's ridiculously young. Like, she's still in her early 20s, and everything she does is just an absolute gem. I was going to try and recommend tracks there. Just listen to anything, because honestly, all of it's good. I don't have a track of hers that I don't think is dynamite. She's way more on the soulful side than on the upbeat side, but man, everything she does is amazing. Her voice is incredible. Lyrically, man, deep as fuck. Deep as fuck. And as far as mainstream artists go, top tier, man. Top tier. Gabby Wilson, to give her real name. Full props. I did also mention Anderson .Paak. Are you an Anderson .Paak guy?
Again, this is all news to me.
This is wild to me, dude, because as a drummer, you should be all about Anderson .Paak. Because Anderson .Paak is a singer, MC, and fucking dynamite drummer, my dude.
Wow.
All of his records are great. It's kind of crazy to me, but also super fucking so exciting that he is such a huge artist, because the stuff he does is so avant-garde in some ways, but it just happens to be funky enough and kind of hip-hop enough that it appeals to enough people in the mainstream. He's an amazing lyricist, inimitable voice. The voice is incredible. His voice is from, dragged all the way up from the 1960s, the classic soul era. It oozes soul, it drips soul, and he has that attitude that, if the production was right, you could be easily fooled into thinking you were listening to something from the late 60s, early 70s, but just as comfortable within classic golden era hip hop, and just obviously as comfortable within present day. The guy can do it all. He's amazing, man. He's got a great attitude as well. He's a super cool human being from all sources as far as I can tell. But he's a dynamite drummer, dude, and there's plenty of YouTube videos of him singing and rapping whilst drumming. Getting about it, man. You will dig it.
That sounds like something that would be right up my street. I'm going to check him out.
And that's been another episode of F Sub R&B. Join us again when we go off on another random segue about music that most of you don't care about.
So much fun talking about pandemics and the horrors of empire. Do we really have to bring the tone down by talking about episode 3 of Lovecraft Country?
That is harsh, dude. I'm not as harsh on this as you are, clearly. I will say, though, I did not enjoy this episode. But I will also say there are elements I really enjoy. But they are elements which the episode did not dwell on in any way whatsoever. They were passing details, were mainly the things I liked. So, all right, let's get into it. So, as said, written by Misha Green, directed by Daniel Sackheim. The title is Holy Ghost. In my opinion, it should have been titled Rent a Ghost.
We've got spooks and ghouls and freaks and fools at Rent a Ghost.
And if you are a British person, you will get that reference, particularly if you're a British person of a certain age.
I mentioned the Rent a Ghost reference to Sarah, and she had no idea what I was talking about.
Oh, man. Yeah, I guess this is official. You should be thrown in jail.
Yeah, being 7 years my junior, as she is, she missed the Rent a Ghost train, man.
Oh shit, man, that's crazy. Okay, well, to fill you all in, Rent a Ghost was a British kids TV show in the late 70s and 80s, in which a recently deceased entrepreneur who was a bit of a loser in real life, in his living life, decided to try and make money for himself and other similar loser ghosts. To make some money. Why ghosts need to make money, I don't know, right? Just don't give me those questions. I don't know that. But they decided that they were going to make money as tourist attractions, essentially. And so they would have very comical, spooky appearances that were more laughable than scary. And so most of the stuff in this episode of Lovecraft Country immediately made me think of Rent a Ghost, and not in a complimentary way, in case you have not already interpreted that for yourself.
Yeah, we have a fondness for Rent a Ghost, I guess, between us, in a way that we both remember it from our childhoods. This is not a fond reference in terms of what we expect from Lovecraft Country.
If this episode of Lovecraft Country was marketed as a kids' TV show, I'd be okay with it. So we get a flash of what I think is it's either just a random church service, or it's possibly the service for George's funeral. Is it
the start?
It's not clarified either way, but we do get it closes in on Letty. Now, can I just say, I've already sang Journey Smollett's praises in this podcast, but I love any actor who can do what she does right at the start of this episode, where this just emoting without any words. I think she does an amazing job here. Now, Johnny Smollett's blessed with one of those faces that every actor envies, that's very expressive, where even the most subtle expression can carry so much weight. And she makes a lot of it in this first scene. I like that single tear rolling down her face, and the mixture of regret, guilt, sadness on her face. I did find this really affecting. If the rest of the episode did not exist, I would say this scene is amazing. But unfortunately, there's another 59 minutes to go, guys, so buckle in. Interestingly, that scene is scored. We do not get any on-set sound for that scene. Precious Ebony is the name of the spoken word poet, that's what the track is that we hear here. And it's a trans woman is the artist, and it's an ode to another trans woman. And I'm mentioning this just because I do think this is one of the things this show is doing that is quite positive. is introducing these subtextual elements where we're encouraged to think about liberation in a broader sense. And I'm glad that this show is doing that. I'm about to have a whole load of misgivings about this episode, so I do want to make clear I'm so excited about the fact they did do that. I thought that was a really nice touch, and I think particularly in this historical moment where we are now, it felt quite powerful to me. It did feel powerful to me. I did have a bit of a tear in my eye when I saw this opening sequence. And then we go into the episode. All right, so this episode makes it clear very quickly that it is adopting that anthology format. So we know we are in a self-contained kind of format here. We get this title card where it tells us, in 1955, a group of African Americans moved into a house. Chicago's, is it North Side?
Yep.
So it's in the white neighborhood. Yeah. So, and later 3 people went missing, never to be seen again. Pioneering is dangerous. I liked that title card, and even looking back, I still like it. I still think it was a cool thing to do. Unfortunately, the episode goes downhill, guys. For me personally, and I feel like you feel possibly the same way, James. I'm getting that feeling.
To be fair, it had a pretty low perch to go downhill from, but congratulations, it managed it.
Okay, so we get this scene of Ruby and Letty, and I said on our commentary in the first episode, I love these two characters together. I love the chemistry between these two actors. I think the relationship between those two characters is really interesting. I was hoping we would get more of this. When this scene opened, I was like, yes, we're getting more of this. Guys, we were not getting more. We were getting less, because this whole scene is literally exposition. It is literally, oh yeah, so all that money I owed you from that thing I did and blah, 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 and obviously I owe you money, and did I mention I owe you money? This was painful. These actors are doing such a great job, and this dialogue is fucking bullshit. I'm just going to come out and say it was horrible. Let's move on. The house that Letty is moving into, how cool is that fucking house, man?
It's a pretty fucking sweet house.
It's an amazing house.
Although, if you've got a house with 3 floors and a basement, why the fuck do you want to put a piano on any floor other than the ground floor?
Right, yeah, that's a good point. Yep. That didn't even occur to me, but you're right. But it's an amazing house, and this is one of the few things which, please don't take offense, American listeners. It's one of the few things I'm jealous of Americans of. I love those design sort of houses, those wooden houses. I love that shit, particularly this looks like it was built in the kind of Victorian era. I don't know what it was about American architects in the Victorian era, what they were all smoking, but it was some fucking deep shit, man. It was great. They designed some far out houses. This is so peculiarly American, that style of architecture, that I love this kind of stuff, because I don't know if you relate to this, James, but it reminds me of whenever I watched American movies as a kid. When I saw houses like that, and I did not understand that America was a different culture because I was too young to understand that, it also used to make me think, where are these mad houses, man? Because this architecture is crazy. So where can I find a house like that? And obviously, we live in Scotland, and it's full of fucking dilapidated buildings that are centuries old, whereas American buildings are like 20 years old.
Like, fuck, look at this ancient ruin from 1920.
Right, exactly. We have proper ruins, but there's just something special about that style of architecture, because it's so alien to anything we see in our landscape, James. Do you relate to it? Do you understand what I'm saying?
I understand what you're saying, yeah. But it also, nowadays, it just puts me in mind of any time I see a building like that, my first thought is plantation.
Right, okay, yeah. That's true. Yep. Fair enough.
But the fact that she's moving into that in the north side of Chicago in a predominantly white neighborhood, it makes sense that it's a sort of like plantation-looking house.
It does, yeah.
So she's taking it over.
Yeah, aesthetically, it's on point, definitely.
Holy shit, Craig.
Yep.
I just said something positive about the last episode.
and it's recorded for posterity, man.
You
can never deny it.
Klaxon.
So this house is incredible, and I love that. I do generally like this scene with Letty and Ruby. I just hate the fact that it is pretty much all exposition, and man, it makes me sad. And the reason it makes me sad, and I do want to make this clear right now, The reason that I'm so disappointed in this is because I do feel this show is capable of greatness. I feel the writers of this show are capable of greatness, and it frustrates me that they have not done that. In my opinion. I feel they have fallen drastically short.
You know how there's I think is it pronounced the Bechdel test or the Bechdel test?
Mm-hmm.
Is there one like that where they're having a conversation but it's not just straight exposition?
It's an interesting parallel to draw, because the Bechdel test is always interesting to me, because I remember saying this to you before. As a writer, most of my main characters are female, and that's not because of SJW conscious fucking whatever. I am an SJW, in case you're wondering. If you hate SJW, guys, you're listening to one. I'm sorry. Not sorry. But it's not because of that. It's just because that's just the way the stories need to be told. But I'm always interested in women's voices and what women have to say, particularly in these earlier parts of the history where women weren't granted the opportunity to speak as much. And so one thing that I always like about these kind of stories that are set in these kind of periods, and it's not that long ago, man. The 1950s is fucking yesterday in terms of human history, but nobody was listening to women. It makes me really excited for that reason that we have 2 black women on screen in a story set in the 1950s. So I hang on to every word both these characters say, and ultimately I'm disappointed that everything they say is just servicing the plot. And I'm going to quote Sam Esmail here: fuck plot. And Sam Esmail has made that very clear many times, that plot should not be the most important thing in a TV drama, because the characters are just as important. And the time you spend with the characters should be just as important. That is what I wanted from this scene, man. Basically, Letty buys this house. We do not know the circumstances of how she bought this house, although the show lets us know that there's obviously questions we should be asking about how a black woman can buy a house in the north side of Chicago in 1955. We will get the answer to that later. Interesting note here, Ruby says there has been black families driven out of this neighbourhood recently. Her dialogue here is actually based on a real life event. And I did actually look this up. There was several cases, in fact, of black families being driven out violently from the north side of Chicago in 1955, around this time. So what Ruby is saying here does have basis in reality. And again, this is one of the things I like about the show, what it's trying to do. So we get the freefall elevator, classic horror movie trope, I thought, which was clearly indicating to us this is going to fucking kill someone later. So we get a scene back at George and Hippolyta's place, where Tick is still staying at this point. And it's quite clear that Hippolyta does not know the actual facts around what happened with George's death, because who would believe that shit? I don't know, how did you feel about this scene where we see Hippolyta with a copy of Dracula, which we know is George's favourite book, and she's tearing pages out of it? That seemed to me a really nice portrayal of grief, and how she might be projecting her grief onto a sense of anger to the thing that maybe she feels led to her husband's death.
I didn't think it like that, but when you bring that up, that's an interesting take on it. That she's equating that sort of white pulp horror literature that he was so into as playing a role in his death, given that she says later that she knows there's something they're not telling her about it. But honestly, I just thought it was a portrayal of she was just sitting with something of his and like unconsciously just ripping it apart. Also, part of me thought that they were trying to foreshadow some sort of possession bullshit.
Right, okay.
Because
yep,
I
that's
was
possible.
Fully expecting that. And even though it didn't happen, I was just like, oh, it's a haunted fucking house episode. His wife's possessed.
Yep. I got a definite sense of anger from that scene. I felt she was definitely angry, possibly even at George. And I feel like that's something that might be explored down the line, but I guess we'll see. I don't know. At this point, I don't know. But I thought it was interesting. I like the performance of it. There was an inscrutable quality. It could have been just grief, or it could have been anger. Now, here's the thing I wanted to talk about. After that, we get the scene at the dinner table, and Tick announces that he's not going to be staying another night. He's decided it's time to leave. He's kind of overstayed his welcome, he's generally feeling. He tells Hippolyta that he already sent away the proofs of the latest entries of the guide, so Hippolyta doesn't need to worry about it. I like the undercurrent of conflict between Hippolyta and Tick at this point, because it is a classic kind of man stepping in, oh, I'll just do this, it's fine, sort of thing. I'll sign off on this. He was trying to do a good thing, but you can tell, I think, that Hippolyta was a bit like, well, wasn't really your job, you know? I was supposed to do that. I was supposed to sign off on the proofs, kind of thing. And I think you feel that Hippolyta is a bit pissed off about it. But at the same time, she also appreciates Tick's company. And I think the actress who plays Hippolyta, she did a good job of conveying that conflicting emotion. And again, these are things I like about the show. It's these quiet moments in the show I really like. I feel like this is what the show is getting right. It's just a shame there's not more of them. And what the cherry on that particular little cake on this scene was when Dee has that weird moment where she just looks down at the table setting and there's no explanation for why she's done that. And Tick says, "Are you all right?" She says, "Yeah, I'm fine." I was fully expecting a Sarah Palmer / Maddie Palmer like vision of Bob to appear on the table mat at that point. They did not quite do that. That's a Twin Peaks reference for you guys who don't do a Twin Peaks. They didn't do that. They just left it alone. This is one of the things I'm still tuned into the show about. I really like wee Dee. I think she's quite a cool character. I like they've just drawn this out so far. I have no idea whether this character is an accurate representation of what's presented in Matt Ruff's novel. I do not know. So I don't know whether this is a whimsy on the part of the TV writers, but I'm digging the way that's played so far. It's one of the things that I'm like, okay, I'm going to keep watching because I quite like this. But yeah, it gave me strong Sarah / Maddie Palmer. Sorry. Oh my God. Hand in my Twin Peaks fan card right now. Sarah Palmer / Maddie Ferguson.
Oh, sorry. Are you going to ask if it's... Next to you can ask if it's something to do with the 4-H club? Jesus.
Doubtful, Andy.
You just got your card back from...
The two Twin Peaks fans listening to this are absolutely ecstatic at this.
They're in hog fucking heaven right now. They're in the White Lodge. They faced their doppelganger with absolute courage.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. They're so happy they're going to encase themselves in a papier-mâché pawn. Alright, so moving on.
Okay, so that scene, I had wondered if the placemat that she was sitting at that point was maybe where George usually sat, if there was some sort of like...
That occurred to me as well, but
Yeah,
she had laid out the correct amount of table places for who was there. Mm-hmm. So that made me think, well, it wasn't that. So we see Tick go back to Montrose's apartment. They have a wee bit of a discussion. I did quite like this interplay between Jonathan Majors. Actually, I don't think I've mentioned Jonathan Majors' name on this podcast so far, have I?
Nope.
Oh shit, man! I've tried my best to mention all the actors in line with the characters. Jonathan Majors plays Atticus. He's doing a great job, man. He's really good. I find him really engaging. He's got a great face. He's got one of those faces that's just... I see every emotion on that face. He's great, man. He's doing a great job. But Atticus goes back to Montrose's apartment. I like this underplayed thing between him and Montrose where he says, I need to stay here for a couple of nights, and Montrose just says, yeah. And it's not a big thing. Wee details like that, this is what the show is doing right, man. Yeah, actually, I should mention before that, when Tick walks in, Montrose is actually asleep, and he's talking in his sleep. And Tick splashes water over him, and it seems like Tick knows what he's saying, and Tick actually says, I got you, kid. As if knowing that's what Montrose is going to say. And when Montrose wakes up, Tick says, oh yeah, that's a story George told me all the time about you and him. You went off on this whatever. You had
the guy with the bat turns up. Right,
yeah, there was these white guys that hassled you, and then this black guy turned up like Jackie Robinson, whapped them all in the head with a baseball bat and said, I got you, kid. Now, I feel like this has got to be a bigger thing later. And obviously it was referenced in the first episode at the very start of the show with the Jackie Robinson reference where Jackie Robinson actually says to Tick in the dream, I got you, kid. This has to mean something, right?
There's 7 hours left of this show.
There is
I could be
still
shitting all over it for no reason.
Well, that's kind of where I'm trying to come down on at the moment. because there are 7 hours. Like 7 hours is a long time. We've spent 3 hours with this show, so anything can happen in 7 hours. And I feel like this is just me. For me personally, I feel like the show is what the show is doing right. I have enough enthusiasm about it that I'm willing to stay along with the ride, and I'm thinking that maybe they will still do something positive enough in the long run that will make me think this was rewarding and that it was planned. At this moment in time, I just don't know, and it would be unfair of me to judge one way or the other. Yeah, so Atticus says we could have used that stranger in Ardum, to which Montrose just keeps stum. He doesn't say anything. You get the feeling he wants to say something, but doesn't say anything. I'm going to say right now, though, see, when it comes to Michael K. Williams, there is every possibility. I am reading nuances into this character that are not there purely because Michael K. Williams just imbues that level of depth into any character he plays. So the writing might not reward any of this stuff. So every time he's on screen, I'm like, oh, there must be some greater meaning here. There might not be, guys. I may just be on the MKW trip, you know.
Maybe he just needed a paycheck.
Well, the thing is, like, I think MKW is 100% savvy enough to pick up on... he's obviously 100% aware of all the references and all the historical allusions this show is making, and I 100% see why somebody of his stature would be attracted to this project on that basis alone. I think actually this is the crux of why I wanted to talk about Lovecraft Country at all, even before I even saw it. And I will get back to this episode specifically in a second, but I do just want to segue while this is in my mind before I forget to say this. We are in a historical moment right now where a lot of Western white culture is only for the first time reckoning with the legacy of colonialism and the legacy of slavery and the legacy of all the things that we are taught from a young age we're supposed to be proud of, that for a lot of people, they are only questioning it for the first time. And I think what this show is doing by reckoning with the spectre of Lovecraft, because Lovecraft is such, up until recently, an unassailable icon of weird fiction. I feel like what the show is doing, even if the show is terrible in its execution, even if after 10 episodes this show turns out to have cack-handedly mishandled everything, the fact that even attempted to do this is in itself important, because Lovecraft has always been unassailable until recent years.
Do you think so?
I do think so, yes.
I thought he'd always been obviously a shit.
He has been obviously a shit, but there's a difference between recognising someone as obviously a shit and not questioning their place in the pantheon. Mm-hmm. And Lovecraft's place in the pantheon has never been questioned.
I've seen him being defended as he was a terrible racist, but he was a product of his time and his environment. I'm a big fan of his writing, though. I will say he's a shitbag. Same.
I mean, here's the thing, right? I mean, you and I both grew up in the same era, so we both received this stuff in the same way. Lovecraft has always been a god amongst fans of weird fiction. And yes, you're right, it's always been accepted he was always a bit of a shit, in terms of he was always an utter racist. Here's the thing, though, and I know as soon as I say this, you're going to say, oh yeah, that's true. We were always taught to believe that Lovecraft's racism was part of a larger misanthropy. He just hated people.
Yeah, that was always given as an excuse, almost.
That was the big excuse for Lovecraft for decades and decades. And this is why he's been able to get away with it for so long, is that so much of his worldview chimes in so many ways with a kind of nihilistic worldview. And nihilism is one of those things that can be positive or negative. That's the nature of nihilism. And it's one of those things that a lot of weird fiction fans really, really kind of tag onto this. You really latch onto this stuff and you think, well, Lovecraft is great because he hates everyone. But the problem with an upper middle class white male, particularly in that era of the United States, hating everyone, is that it's impossible for him to hate everyone equally.
Yeah.
He cannot hate everyone equally. because he's born into a society that already treats non-white middle-class Presbyterian people specifically as kind of subhuman. And so this whole thing about him being a misanthrope, people love to use that as the defense. It's a flimsy defense, and it's been overused. I see why people use it, but when you look at Lovecraft in the context of the time he existed, it doesn't hold water. It doesn't. Because at some point you have to say, given the life he experienced, isn't it true that he hated black people most of all?
His quote-unquote misanthropy was probably more so than your average person based on fear, based on phobia. Like, I mean, sure, a lot of that informed his writing, that fear of the other, that, like, Both Hands in the Air, he translated it into brilliant horror, but he was obviously experiencing that on a daily basis through fear that was also baseless hatred of anything that wasn't him,
Absolutely.
which was, like
Absolutely.
you say, white, male, middle-class, Presbyterian, American. So it's weird how much of a horrible individual he was, informed aspects of his writing, because in order to create true horror, he had to be a horrible bastard himself.
Yeah, yep, 100%. In order to see the worst in humanity, he had to be the worst in humanity. That's absolutely true. I mean, he's kind of the epitome of everything that weird fiction needed, in a sense, because he was both the source of a great bibliography and also in himself a case study. Lovecraft has had such a prevailing influence all through the decades that at some point you have to reckon with who he was as a human being. Because no matter how great an artist you are, who you are as a human being informs every aspect of who you are as an artist. And this is why the whole thing about separate the art from the artist is bullshit.
Hang on, I've got YouTube comments.
Is that
on
the
the
YouTube
phone.
comments? Put the YouTube comments through.
I watched an extensive video by a YouTuber, a young man of colour, a sci-fi nerd, massive Lovecraft fan, who was literally espousing for the separation of art from the artist where Lovecraft was concerned. And I was conflicted watching it. I'll find that and not post a link to it when we upload this episode.
This conversation has reminded me. So the World Fantasy Award, its actual statuette, was a bust of Lovecraft right up until 2015. Now, in 2011, Nnedi Okorafor, who's a Nigerian-American writer of fantasy science fiction, she won the award for Who Fears Death. Now, the Who Fears Death is an amazing novel, by the way. Great novel. But she won that year. She was presented as a prize with a bust of HP Lovecraft, who is someone who hated her people. Hated anyone who looked like Nnedi Okorafor, anyone who had any kind of culture similar to Nnedi Okorafor. And Nnedi Okorafor, while accepting the award, she later wrote an essay saying, surely in this day and age, it is utterly unacceptable that someone like me should have to accept an award shaped in the form of someone who hated people who looked like me. Surely that should not be controversial. And it led to a massive controversy. Eventually, in 2015, the World Fantasy Award did change its statuette. But it took 4 years, man. It took 4 years before they finally said, all right, okay, let's get rid of Lovecraft.
How did they change it to?
It's no longer a person. It's now just a kind of a spooky tree against a moon kind of thing. But it's wild, man. I mean, this is why, all this thing about separating the art from the artist, for as long as we recognize that this is a field that weird fiction, science fiction, fantasy fiction is a thing we want to celebrate, and we want to recognize someone like HP Lovecraft as a major progenitor or a major figure in that tradition, you cannot not also recognize the fact he was a massive fucking racist, because we are not we writers of fantasy fiction can come from any background. It's outrageous that a person of colour should have to accept as an award the likeness of someone who is an utter bigot against people that looked like them. That's crazy, man. It shouldn't be controversial, but it was controversial for a good few years. And it's wild to me that even within the last 10 years, we were still having this as a conversation. Last note about this before I move on to this episode. HP Lovecraft, one of the excuses often given to him is he was a product of his time. It's true, he was a product of his time, and he was definitely a product of his place, and he was definitely a product of his upbringing. He was very, very secluded as a child. When you read that into his fiction about just how secluded and upper middle class he was, of course it makes sense that anything different is fucking terrifying. But it is worth noting that even by the standards of the early 20th century, his racism was regarded as outrageous by many of his peers.
Yep.
And many of his peers took him to task for his racism. And this is the 20s and 30s, man. It's like there were people saying to him, hey, Howard, go to fucking rein it in a wee bit, mate.
Yeah, you're talking about a guy who, again, I'm not going to say the word, but if you look it up, you can read what he called his cat. That's not someone who was a product of his time.
No, there were already people around him saying, mate, that's not cool, by the way.
In a time, in segregation era America, people were like, bro, it's a bit far.
Yeah. There are some really interesting, in fact, you can look them up online, there's plenty of examples of it, but it's a lot of examples of Lovecraft's correspondence with some of his peers. Many of them take him to task for the intensity of his racism. They're like, really, dude, is this the hill you want to die on kind of thing? Because this is wild.
Can I take a moment to fly off on a journey beyond the stars, as it were?
James, I cannot wait for this.
You, I believe, are not super familiar with the oeuvre of Star Trek, are you not?
I have a fondness for Star Trek, but only in the kind of, I remember watching the original series on repeats back when I was a kid in the 80s kind of way.
So you're not familiar with the spin-off series Star Trek Deep Space Nine?
Negative.
Okay, right. So there's one particular episode of Star Trek Deep Space Nine which, following a trope that you're very fond of, the captain of the space station spends the episode in a hallucination, induced by another entity. Big fan of that, I know you are. However, the fantasy...
I'm already tired.
So the captain of the space station is Avery Brooks, an African-American actor. He was the first black captain portrayed in any Star Trek canon.
Mm-hmm.
And the fantasy that he is portrayed in is as the role of a writer of pulp science fiction for a magazine in 1950s segregation America. And the rest of the cast of the show are all playing the other writers that work in this magazine. Everyone in the magazine has their photographs next to their stories except for him, and that kind of thing. And it's a really kind of brutal look at racism in the 1950s, done by fucking in a 45-minute episode of Star Trek, to a degree that I think you would probably really enjoy, regardless of whether or not you're a fan of DS9. The episode name is Beyond the Stars, and it is widely regarded as one of, if not the best episodes of Star Trek ever made. But it's a fantastic episode of television, 45 minutes, super tight, super affecting, and it follows a lot of the same kind of themes that Lovecraft Country has in terms of what does it mean for an African American in the 1950s to be someone who is like a fan of a genre that neglects you, so to speak, you know. So just saying, if anyone out there has access to it, check out DS9. I believe it's season 6 or season 7, the episode Beyond the Stars.
Alright, sweet. Yep. Alright, let's move on. Letty's house. She has a bunch of bohemians moving in. Now, I love this shit. I'm about to tell you why I love this shit. What was your reaction to this whole sequence of all these people moving in? What were you thinking?
Do you know, actually, right, I know you said you loved it. It left me a bit cold, but the overriding feeling it gave me was the let's make an omelette scene from Spider-Man 3. You know the scene I'm talking about? I
do, oh my god. That gets a hashtag yikes from me, dog. Okay, there were a number of things I liked about this. First of all, on a technical aspect, I just liked the way it was put together. I liked the way we followed Letty around the rooms. I will get an echo of it later in the next montage when she's at the party. Those scenes are nicely matched together. But you'll hear me clapping in excitement because I did several jump up moments during this because I was like, I get that reference. So one of the tenants turns up with a dog. His name is James. She says, what's the dog's name? He says, Baldwin. And they both laugh. And we get the impression he's a writer. And I'm like, that's fucking James Baldwin, man. It's like, could they signpost this any harder? It's like, that's meant to be James Baldwin. I get it. Now, there are other parts in this episode where the references to real life people are a bit more, I will say, realistic. The James Baldwin one, I'm not sure tracks, because he was definitely not anywhere near this part of the country at this point in history in the mid-50s. He definitely moved to Europe at this point, I'm pretty sure. I know my Baldwin well enough to know he was in Europe by this point. But still, I was like, it's cool, it's cool. I dig it,
Is it a bit like in Doctor Who, when wherever he goes back to a certain historical period, he always meets loads of famous people from that period, regardless of whether they would be in that place at that time?
I'm going to lay my cards on the table here. This episode basically tells us that Letty is friends with everyone famous in the 50s, or who will become famous maybe a decade later. I'm here for it. I'm here for that. I love that.
She's the
I love
Johnny
that
Burrell
aspect
of the African American art scene of the 1950s.
Exactly, and I loved that. I thought that was cool. I really enjoyed that. I thought it was a nice conceit, and I thought the show handled that quite well. It's the one thing I think this episode handled well, and I enjoyed it enough that I did not come away from the whole episode hating the show. Because if it had not been for that, things could have been different. That's all I'm saying. But these things I really enjoyed. I love the fact James Baldwin is in there. This first scene, I don't know how many other references there are to real life artists. There may be more that I did not pick up on. The idea that there might be makes me a bit excited. I can go back and check those out. I got a real vibe from that scene that this is what the show was doing. It's like, oh, Letty's connected with everybody. And I was like, fine. Okay, I'm cool with that. I totally dig that shit. I love that scene. I really liked it a lot. And I found it a precursor to the party scene, which I found an even bigger payoff of this stuff, which I will talk about when we get there in just a second. Tick shows up while all this is happening. He suggests he might be leaving. Letty offers him a room. He says, no, I better go because I told my boss I was going to be away for a few days, and that was a month ago. I don't know how he still has a job, frankly.
Yeah, this was the first point in the show that I was like, oh wait, he's still in the army.
But I do like this thing with the white supremacists turn up, honking their horns, and Tick says, maybe I'll stick around. I did like the way that played out. I thought that was quite cool. It was predictable as fuck, but I thought it was nice. Sometimes predictable is nice. This was for sure a real threat that black people faced in Chicago at that time. I mean, there is a line here which I thought was quite a clever line where Tick says, good job you did it while everyone's at church. So we know they're doing it on a Sunday. So all the white Presbyterians are away at church, and that's when Letty chose to move everybody in. I thought that was quite a nice, well-observed detail.
I liked the point when, I guess this is later in the episode, I'm jumping ahead, but I did like when he turned up at the party in his military uniform, because there's
I'm going to mention that in a bit.
There's that line that even your most fucking redneck racist won't cross, which is the thank you for your service line.
Yes, right, that's true. Yeah, and I guess that's what Tick is banking on. So what I liked here was the utter banality of the racist signs, where they say, we are a white neighbourhood, undesirables are not welcome. So they do not even mention the fact that the undesirables are black. It's just taken as given.
Well, yeah, the signs were like the lawn signs that they always put on during elections. It's like that.
Right, yes, it's that banal. Letty wakes up, having the covers taken off her, and here is where I have written in block capitals, goosebumps, exclamation mark. I do not mean that as in I had goosebumps. I mean it as in the children's novelization series. I mean it in that sense, that I was not scared and this felt ridiculous.
I had one note for that scene, which was, mate, where's your jaw?
Yeah, so we see this phantom figure by Letty's bed that is without a jaw, and it's probably the least scary thing I've maybe ever seen. But it was meant to be scary for somehow. Who finds this scary, James? Who are the people who find this scary, do you reckon?
I think there's a common misconception among the writers/directors of horror films, who mistake the success of films like Paranormal Activity and Insidious and those kinds of films, which are in the horror genre but aren't scary. They're films that rely on jump scares and spectacle rather than horror. But because they're so successful, a lot of people, I think, mistake that for, oh, this is a scary film, whereas it's not. It's tropey, it's spectacular. There's, if you throw some gore in, it's fine, but you know, jump scares are the big thing. You get like a brass musical cue and a quick camera change and boom, you've got a horror film. Whereas, not to go on Mark Kermode here, but the most frightening horror movie for me of the last 30 years... Are you going to start singing La International? No, it's fucking Fire Walk With Me.
Oh yeah, oh for sure, that's definitely up there.
Genuinely terrifying movie. It was so otherworldly that, and so almost like so alienly weird that it terrified me.
Yeah.
And to bring that back, that's what Lovecraftian horror should represent. To be fair, in defence of this episode, Letty says a line later in the episode that I wrote down that for the first time in this whole show really grasps that Lovecraftian horror feeling of inscrutable terror. But Billy Najaw pulling your sheets off is not it.
Yeah, for sure. So Letty gets up, she's far too hot, the horns are blaining outside. She's like, what the fuck is going on? She goes down to the basement, the boiler is all fucked up for some reason, it's making the heat go wild. Then underneath the boiler, there's this fucking trapdoor. I have written The Feeble Dead. Because I was like, this is the worst remake of The Evil Dead ever. You can tell by this point in the episode, I was like, no.
Portions of this episode are in love with The Evil Dead.
So she gets Tick down to help her investigate. They kind of look around. Tick speculates maybe this is some kind of PTSD slash... the neighbours fucking around. Some combination of that is presenting this. I dug that, actually. I thought that was quite a cool way of interpreting this stuff. Maybe it is. At this point, I was looking for ways to salvage what they had just presented me with, because I hated the jawless fucking ghost thing and the feeble dead underneath the fucking basement door. By this point, I was like, no, man. Give me something to hold on to. So when Tick was saying, oh, maybe it's it's your mind playing tricks on you. The neighbours are obviously fucking with you. Some combination of all that stuff, and I was like, okay, cool, I'm still on board.
I had the opposite reaction, Craig.
Really?
Do you know? And I'll tell you why. Because I had a why does Scully not believe in aliens reaction. I was like, you spent 2 episodes fighting literal fucking monsters. You saw into the Garden of Eden. You saw all sorts of weird spells being cast, witchcraft shit. Why are you now doubting that she saw ghosts?
That is not an unfair comment. I have no comeback. Tick suggests this basement would be an ideal place for a dark room, and he's right, as it happens. We then go to day 8, as the caption tells us. We've got a house party, as I've written here. For me, Eye of the Duck. I thought all of this, Eye of the Duck, amazing.
Give me more of that music.
If we can accept this whole sequence as being one scene, then Eye of the Duck.
Oh, yeah.
I loved everything about this, pretty much. Letty going around the guests and refilling their punch glasses, the snatches of conversation. Man, I loved all of this. I loved the atmosphere. This felt like the 1950s to some white fucking dude that was never alive in the 1950s. I loved this shit. I really felt this show came alive at this point. Johnny Smollett, again, knocking it out the fucking park. I like the way she interacts differently with all the different guests. She has a different face almost for all the different guests. I love that. It was great performance, great writing. That shit was really good. We then go upstairs into what seems like the attic, where Dee is with a bunch of her pals, and they are fucking around with an Ouija board. Now, James.
Yes.
Can I ask you, when you were a kid growing up, or maybe as a teenager, did you ever fuck with the old Ouija board?
Of course not, Craig. Because I fucking saw like 70s and 80s horror movies when I was young. I was shit scared of Ouija boards. I would never have touched one within a million fucking miles of my house. No thank you. No Ouija boards for me. You don't go to video shop that sells illegal copies before it was unbanned in the UK of The Exorcist. Buy a copy of The Exorcist on VHS when it was still banned in the UK, watch it, and then go, I want to play with a Ouija board. No, sir.
Interesting, because I fucked with an Ouija board quite a bit.
Really?
I did, yeah. And so this scene really brought some nostalgia back to me. Some very dark nostalgia.
Did you get any results?
Well, I will not. Here, I tell you what, this is a conversation for another episode,
Okay.
so put a pin in this. But I will say for now, at age 9 or 10, I was very scarred by the experience of having been anywhere near an Ouija board, to the extent where I did not go near one again until I was about 13. And I remember when I was about 13, we had an experience that was very, very, very similar to the one portrayed in this episode of Lovecraft Country. So this scene I dug, because I was like, man, I'm on board with this. I remember this shit happening.
Shit. See, I've seen in my later years, I've seen enough Darren Brown to be a total skeptic as far as Ouija boards are concerned. Fuck a Ouija board. But when I was younger, despite being like a skeptic about the supernatural when I was younger as well, I'd seen enough movies to be a bit scared of touching it.
Right, okay. Yeah. Here's the other reason this scene excited me. There are two characters in this scene, right, that are particularly notable. So we've got Dee, she's surrounded by several people. One of the characters is referred to as Bobo. He's a young kid. He's wearing a black tie with a white stripe down the centre. He asks the Ouija board, will I enjoy my trip? The Ouija board says no. So this is actually a reference to Emmett Till.
Mm-hmm.
Emmett Till was a young boy from Chicago who went on a trip to visit family in Mississippi when he was 14 years old in 1955 and was lynched because he was accused of wolf whistling at a white woman, which decades later turned out to not even be true.
Shit.
And this kid in this scene, the tie he was wearing, the costume he's wearing, if you look, if you know what, James, Google Emmett Till right now, you will see photos of him. The production design team on this show just made him into Emmett Till. Yeah, the first images you see, you'll see what I mean.
Oh yeah, shit.
Yeah, so this is a very deliberate by the showmakers here. They've inserted Emmett Till into the show. When I saw this, I immediately noticed it, but it's because of the tie. The tie is so iconic, and I've seen pictures of Emmett Till so many fucking times that I'm like, as soon as I saw that kid wearing that tie, I was like, that's an Emmett Till tie. And then when he said, will I enjoy my trip? And the Ouija board says no, and I was like, what the fuck, when did Emmett Till die? And I immediately Googled it, 1955. I was like, oh fuck, man. I thought that was a very dark and very clever move by the show there. Because Emmett Till was from Chicago,
yeah.
So it made complete sense. They played it nicely. I thought it all worked. And man, see, this is the thing. This is what this show does well, man. I wish it did more of this stuff and less of the bullshit that I'm about to talk about. One of the other kids in that scene is referenced to as Gil.
If it's Gil Scott Heron.
It is Gil Scott Heron. He was born and raised in Chicago.
Right.
And the age more or less matches up. So it does, and this is a party full of bohemians, and Gil Scott Heron's mother was an opera singer. So it does make sense that an opera singer living in Chicago would be attracted to Letty's party.
Right. Uh-huh.
So that again, I kind of dug. I thought, yes, this show is doing the work. Hippolyta is in the kitchen with Letty, and Hippolyta is saying she's intimating that she kind of wants rid of Tick, because Tick is sort of reminding her of George in his behaviour. And Hippolyta goes to find Dee. She goes up to the attic and she shouts up. She doesn't get any reply, and the door opens behind her. Hippolyta goes into the room behind her, and she finds what is an orrery, which is basically, it's an old device for mapping and predicting the movements of celestial bodies. That's what that is.
Yep.
And we know that Hippolyta is a stargazer, so it makes sense that she would be tempted by this device. Another reference I liked here, well, Letty is going around filling everyone's punch glasses. She intervenes in a conversation about a young preacher named Michael, who is changing his name to Martin. Did you get that reference?
Even I got the Martin Luther King reference.
It's a good one. And Letty says, just because he's married a white woman doesn't mean he can't speak up for black folks. That hammers home for me the fact that her father might be a white man. But again, that's just speculation. So Tick comes back in. He noticed Letty on the makeshift dance floor getting a bit heavy petting with some guy.
A wee bit saucy.
And we see, what's his name? I forget the character's name. If I did not wrote it down, I may not have noted it down. Who was the bouncer from the bar in the first episode? Who kind of says he's got designs on Letty, but he kind of gets the feeling that Tick is all about Letty, and he says, if that's the case, then maybe you should stake a claim there.
Oh yeah, that's the thing. The guy says that they used to get frisky back in high school.
Yes.
And I'm like, so I mean, really, like Letty's high school schedule was fucking rammed with her track running, her dart book club, and this bouncer.
The only person with a busier high school schedule than Letty was Laura Palmer at this stage. Who was also dealing coke, taking coke, dating the football captain,
Meals on Wheels.
hanging out with the biker dude, delivering Meals on Wheels, giving English lessons to Josie Packard.
And being a prostitute all at once.
No wonder she needed that coke, man.
Yeah, man. I mean, fuck. If I could do half the stuff Laura Palmer did, I'd be fucking gacked at my nut 24/7.
Tick decides to make his move, so he follows Letty to the bathroom. I realise as I'm saying that now, it sounds a bit seedy, but the scene that follows isn't that seedy, really. It's just a bit uncomfortable. So Tick notices there is some blood after the deed, and Letty kind of brushes it off and says, sorry, I didn't realise it was my time of the month. I took this, I'm an idiot, because I took this at face value first. How did you feel?
I took it at face value as well. I was like, weird choice, writer, but okay.
Same, which shows how fucking stupid us men are. So I was just like,
Tick takes it at face value as well, and is like, just
absolutely.
Up and is like, all right, cool, see you downstairs. Oh,
well, I will say, I will say, I actually think Tick dealt with it the right way, because he didn't make a deal about it. So I actually think it was quite a cool move by Tick. I actually made me think he was quite a decent guy in that scene. Letty does sob afterwards, but I don't think she's sobbing because of what Tick did, anything that he did. I feel like it's just a cathartic moment for her. I think that's what that was. I feel like that's a moment of ownership for her. That was my interpretation anyway.
If we remember that this episode was written by a woman, and what this is a woman losing her virginity to a guy in the bathroom of a party, and then the guy just leaves immediately. Mm-hmm. Is there something there that you and I aren't getting, like aren't understanding, like at
possibly
base level?
Okay, all right, fair enough. I see what you're saying. I think I'm only going on the fact that when Letty and Tick talk about this later in the bar, Letty seems fine with it. Mm-hmm. And I feel like she's at a place at that point where she's not going to bullshit Tick because she's dealing with a haunted house. So I just can't...
I got bigger problems, son. I've got a guy with a baby's head. God, do you know how long we've been doing this podcast? We've not even got to baby head yet.
We've not got to baby head yet. Yeah. So I don't feel at that point she would bullshit Tick. That's what makes me think that this is not that big a deal. Sorry. Let's move on. So that happens. Then we get the white supremacists turn up. They stick a burning cross on the lawn. Now, the burning cross, of course, is a symbol we've seen in popular culture all over the fucking place. I don't know about you, but I felt it was particularly affecting in this case, just because we'd spent so much time in such a kind of normal milieu as the house party. All right, we then get quite a cool action scene of the guys get out their shotguns, where Letty goes out and fucking smashes the cars up. I don't know about you, but I was giving some serious fucking standing up and clapping hands, thinking, go Letty, this is good shit.
That's a good scene.
Loved all that stuff. Yeah, and they get the guns out there before the cops arrive, and the rest of them surrender. Man, that was good shit. See, you know what I mean, man? This is the kind of stuff the show does well. I need more of this stuff, man. Okay, so Letty fucks shit up. The police captain takes her into the back of the police van, does the classic "I'm sorry, officer, she fell" type thing by having the driver just swerve around while he holds onto the leather strap and she gets bumped up. In this dialogue here, he explains that house is the Winthrop house. He doesn't explain too much about what that means.
He just says they found a bunch of body parts.
Yep. And if history is any indicator, you won't be there for very long. So Letty starts to do some research. Here's one of the frustrating things about this episode, man. I want to see Letty do this research.
It's the not enough time in an episode problem once again.
I hate this fucking shit where this captain tells her shit and then suddenly she knows everything because she's done the research that we didn't see. I hate that, man. I want to see this stuff fucking happen. I want to see Letty do the investigation. I want to see Detective Letty. That's what I want. I really badly wanted to see this stuff. It really upsets me we did not get to see it. And I did say earlier in the episode, you could easily split this episode into 2 episodes and it would have been way more satisfying. I want more time with Letty. I want more time to see her figure things out. I don't know why this is suddenly a taboo thing to do in popular culture, to actually have characters progress through their realizations. To me, that's an important part of the journey with a character. On the one hand, it was lazy writing. On the other hand, it was also an example of the way in which the writers had cornered themselves into this template of what they had decided this episode was going to be. They kind of strangled their own writing by doing that, in my opinion.
But do you know what? Is it sort of like the Batman problem? Batman's whole heroic portrait is he is the world's greatest detective. And he's so rarely portrayed on screen as a great detective. He puts on his fucking suit, he goes out, and he just, like, beats villains, right? And people often complain about this. It's a common complaint I've seen many critics make. It's like, we want to see the Batman movie where Batman is the world's greatest detective. But would that be a boring film? Would you rather just see Batman flying around in his fucking Batwing and the Batmobile, beating the shit out of bad guys and doing kung fu and whatnot, because that's a more exciting movie? We're talking here like, we want to see Detective Letty, because I do and you do. But would an episode of Detective Letty have just been watching someone go through newspaper archives? And would that have been an exciting episode of television?
Well, not necessarily, because in order to get those things, she would have to have had liaisons with different people. You have to remember, this is the 1950s. She can't just Google stuff. She's got to go and talk to people.
That's why my TV show pilot, Detective Google, never took off with his butler Ask Jeeves.
And this show opens up the possibility to explore those things. This is the thing. Surely this is the kind of thing this show should be exploring. What were the barriers to Letty investigating this story? There's got to be more to it than this. I want to see that stuff. To me, that's the meat and bones of this show, or it should be. For me personally, to me, that would be the meat and bones of what I would want this show to be. Granted, some people might listen to me saying this, think, well, that would be really boring. If you find that boring, fine, that's okay. If you're digging the show the way it is, cool, I'm happy for you. But for me, I want to spend more time with that character in the world this show has so richly created in its first episode, and which it has not really honoured in the 2 episodes since. That's the way I would phrase it. I want to spend time in that world it promised me in the first episode, and I don't feel like we've visited it since. And that's why I feel very disappointed in the subsequent 2 episodes. Letty does all this work. She presents all her research to Tech and gets him on board with everything. We should mention there is that brief fucking scene beforehand where she somehow has the ability to put all the collage of photographs together with the strange glowing light pattern that makes a face, and then the face comes out the ground. Hashtag goosebumps, hashtag Harry Potter, hashtag I've seen scarier things on a kid's TV show. You know, man, it made me think, and the rest of this episode also made me think, that I feel like the influence of American Horror Story on culture generally has been overwhelmingly negative. And I say that as someone who dug the first couple of seasons of American Horror Story, because I kind of liked the fact that it was just throwing all the fucking shit against the wall and just seeing what stuck. That seemed quite kind of fun back in 2011. Now I'm like, why is every show and every movie now doing this shit?
Shall we fast forward to the ridiculous end exorcism point?
The upshot of this is that Letty convinces Tick that this is a haunted house and that they need to fucking exorcise the ghouls and whatnot. So Tick is on board. They get this Haitian voodoo priest, but she comes up, she sacrifices a goat on the doorstep, and I'm like, okay, man, okay. And this is what I was getting heavy fucking American Horror Story vibes. I was like, okay, we've gone full AHS at this point. See the core of this? There's some interesting ideas here. The execution, however, is fucking terrible. So we have the exorcism scene. I've actually written Rent a Ghost in block capitals 3 times. All of the visuals here are really quite lame. I'm confused as to who it is out there who finds this kind of visual scary. Yep. I mean, other than a child, I can't think it. See, these visuals we get here of the ghosts, I do not find remotely creepy. I laughed out loud at their appearance. It took me right out of the story. I have written Tim Burton's Edward Babyhead. So we get the dramatic, the culmination here with the exorcism, and the priestess gets momentarily possessed, then Tick gets momentarily possessed, then you're right. And in the meantime, we get 3 guys with baseball bats. Now, the imagery here I do quite like, because they are the anti-Jackie Robinson, in a way, these 3 white guys with their baseball bats. I quite appreciate that stuff. But the way they are taken out...
when the guy's face gets taken off by the elevator...
I wrote Vivian Young ones.
Yeah, we had Chekhov's elevator at the start of the episode, so we knew it was going to come into play later. But when it takes... The camera spends so long on his severed face, that it felt like there was about a minute of just... on his face squirting blood, and I'm like, those are scant seconds you could have spent
for sure.
on building
and it was like,
story up.
I bet you didn't expect this. We're gonna wallow on it. It's like, mate, I saw it coming at the start of the episode. It's like, why are you trying to pretend this was a surprise? Yeah, this shit was lame, man. None of this was good. I'm happy a bunch of white douchebags died, don't get me wrong, but the only thing that's good about this entire sequence is Journey Smollett's performance. Because she is giving it her fucking all. I love the really animalistic growl she's giving it when she's completely losing it. She is channeling way more commitment into this performance right now than this scene actually deserves. She really delivers here. I believed every second she was on screen, which is remarkable because everything around her that's going on is complete fucking nonsense. Oh, we didn't mention, actually, that the whole thing about this house is called the Winthrop House, as revealed by the police captain, and that's after Horatio Winthrop, who is one of the sons of Adam, but he splintered off, and he wanted to try and translate the language of Adam for himself, so that he could claim the gateway to the Garden of Eden for himself, and that the next resident of the most recent resident of this house was a guy called Hiram Epstein.
Yeah, so Epstein doesn't kill himself. Instead, his ghost appears as like a frail,
as a
frail
cartoon
white guy.
Fucking sub Ghostbusters 2. Man, this is the worst thing I've seen on television in a while. Honestly, this made me so depressed.
Yeah, all of his quote-unquote experiments that he did, his unsavory experiments, which involved, as it turns out, just putting a baby's head on a guy's body and sticking some stuff into some people's arms.
I appreciate this people who are zany as fuck in the scientific field all throughout history. What is this deal with sewing a baby's head onto a grown man's body? Why would you do that?
There's no reason.
Do you know what this reminded me of? It reminded me of the bit in Toy Story
with the fucking doll's head on the spider body,
where Andy's bully neighbour, where you see his toys where they're all fucking mangled. I was like, this is basically that. This is equally as scary as that right now. I will say, though, and here is another example of where I think the show is at least trying to do some good stuff. Letty calls the names of the victims whose bodies were found in the house. Now, one of them is called Anarcha. Now, that name chimed with me, and I was like, I'm sure I've heard that before. And I Googled it. Black woman, Anarcha. I can't remember what my parameters were, but I eventually realised where I'd heard it before. There's a guy called Marion Sims who is generally regarded as the kind of father of modern gynecology. He was an American physician who quite infamously experimented on black women for a long time. And one of his major test subjects was a woman called Anarcha. And I do feel this was a deliberate reference by the showmakers here. See, this is the kind of stuff I like about the show. I like these little nuggets. I like that they're bringing these things into the story. They're kind of enriching the subtext of the show. It's just a pity they're doing it in a show that has no sense of subtlety whatsoever. So it's kind of a waste of time. We do get quite a neat scene afterwards when actually, I've just realised. In fact, I'll reference it in a second. I can go back. But this reporter turns up to interview Letty about what a success she's made of this house where she's let poor black people live, and this black reporter is going to go. I don't know what this publication this black reporter works for in the 1950s. That's not really given to us here. I love the costume design in this scene. They're both wearing pastel dresses. Letty is in blue, the reporter is in yellow. I think visually it's really interesting and really nice, and as we've said before, the production design is pretty much on point. And the reporter asks her, what about the 3 people who disappeared? And Letty says she doesn't know anything about that. And then we get the downward track down the elevator shaft, and we see the 3 dead bodies. I don't know that was all that powerful, to be honest. I think we saw what was going on there. But the thing I was going to mention that we forgot to mention was when the reporter is talking to her about this, there is an element of guilt with Letty about this, because I feel like Ruby correctly called her out in the previous scene when Letty admits that the money came from her mother, and Ruby says, well, all you've done is make it a kind of harem for your artist friends. You've not really served the community. And so when the reporter is talking to Letty about this stuff at the end, there is probably this kind of sense of guilt with Letty. I thought maybe I could have done more for the community. The reason I think this is interesting in a contemporary sense, I feel like it's a nice commentary on the way in which black cultural elites are seen as spokespeople for the black community, but are always that bit more divorced from the larger black community. And it's a huge talking point in American culture. It is one thing I'm very aware of being in contact with a lot of black activists online, is that they are critical of this element of mainstream black culture, but at the same time, they are 100% protective of the culture that these artists produce. And so there is always this kind of trade-off between, we will 100% criticize these people who create this culture, but we will 100% protect the culture. And if a white person comes for any of those people, we will protect those artists. And I do feel like that part of what this episode is doing is kind of referencing that kind of thing. I think, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, but that was kind of the reference that I interpreted from that. This point is underlined somewhat by the final scene of this episode, which I hated. Atticus tracks down the realtor, or realtists, which it turns out is a different thing.
It's that trope of the mysterious shop was never there, but it kind of is. They catch it just before it's never there, but it's still tropey as fuck.
So Atticus goes to this place. He finds Christina there with this guy named Jerome J. Jackson. Atticus confronts her. Any of the potential that I thought Christina's character had in episode 2, it really sank in this one scene. I hated this. So Atticus says, stay away from my family. He wants to make sure that his loved ones are protected, kind of thing. Christina's giving it to him that, no, you're in this, you're part of us, there's no escape from that, kind of thing.
What does Christina want? She wants spells, man. She wants Sabrina spells, man.
It's revealed here that Christina is in fact responsible for giving them money to Letitia, and that's how they could afford the house. And the house is important because it belonged to Horatio Winthrop, who, as we've said earlier, who splintered off from the Sons of Adam, and that Christina wants to try and reclaim pages of the book that Horatio Winthrop had,
which are in
a booby-trapped vault. Oh my god, the dialogue in this scene is horrendous, and everyone involved in writing that scene, fucking hell, make it stop, guys.
This fucking scene is a booby trap.
Now, the one thing I will say that's kind of positive, I feel like this kind of underlined the previous scene where it's like, well, all of that about the criticism of black elites, it all comes back to, ultimately, they are operating within a white supremacist capitalist system that is manipulating it. And I felt this did a good job of getting that point across. But then it got that point across again, and then again, and then again, and every line it kept getting across. It's like, right, we get it. Okay, I understand. I'm not a fucking idiot. I understand what the show is trying to say, man. And she goes out of her way to explain that everyone gets one spell, and her father's was invulnerability, and that he had to remove it at the moment when he opened the gate to Eden. Now, if that's his one spell, then who in the ever-loving fuck brought Letty back to life? Whose spell was that? I had all these questions. It's like, what the fuck is going on? None of this makes any sense, man. All of it just seems so arbitrary and just piling pointless lore onto pointless lore. I am not digging it. Of course, I've glossed over the point of the scene that she freezes Atticus in place.
Using apparently a spell that's not invulnerability.
So is that her one spell? So I'm assuming we can never see another spell from her. But did we not also see her use some kind of force field in her car?
Yeah.
So how many spells has she got?
Did she not also make George and Leia forget stuff?
Yes.
Christina 3 Spells is her name. Does that mean that it's the rest of Lovecraft Country? So we've been talking about how we hope it improves, but if the rest of the show is Atticus has to find spells for her, you're on your own with this fucking show. I'm stopping it.
If that's the crux of the show, then I'm done as well.
I just realised that Aldous Huxley's Brave New World is a TV show. I'm watching that shit.
I mean, also, her final line to Atticus here, you posted cringe, bro. You can't go around killing white women. It's like, there's no need for this line at this point. All of this is in the subtext of the show. There are so many better ways of conveying this. She does not need to speak this aloud.
Yeah, they lay it on thick.
So based on the teaser for the next episode, it looks like the Goonies. Did you watch the teaser?
There was what looked like a tightrope over a canyon.
I was getting heavy Goonies vibes, which, that's cool. I love the Goonies.
Vibe, but
I'll watch that shit.
Look, if this shit turns into Dungeons and Dragons meets Call of Cthulhu times the Goonies, maybe this show will pull out the bag. I might love the next episode. But, you know.
Yeah, I'm struggling to get any further, but listen, man, I wanted to talk about this show because I think it's an important show to talk about. It seems to me that it wants to be a different show from the one I would like to see this show be. And that's equally my problem as much as it is the show's problem. So I was just looking for something this show, it seems, was not interested in providing. Now, again, we've got 7 more hours to go, so we'll see where it goes. And I am going to stick with it because, hey, I've got nothing else to do in fucking lockdown.
Yeah. Look, we can look at it this way. The first 3 hours of this show have, regardless of how long this episode of our podcast ends up being, has sparked 6 hours of discussion between us.
Oh, Jesus Christ.
So it clearly has given us something to talk about.
I think my hope is, after Watchmen and then this, I'm hoping this is kick-starting some kind of sort of renaissance in some way where we get these kind of stories that are really investigating the problematic history of race relations in the USA, and perhaps it might have echoes outwards to, you know, the kind of culture we're producing in this country, where we can confront our own fucking imperialist past and really reckon with that in an interesting fictional way, which, by the way, I am trying to do in Codex Widdershins, which is why I mentioned it earlier. So I do feel like this is the moment to be doing this kind of stuff. I'm hoping we are living, if this current epoch of humanity is going to produce anything positive, I'm hoping it's that we're somehow finally dealing with all of the imperial narratives and colonial narratives that we've been indoctrinated with, and we can start to really dissect them and start to really write a whole new bunch of stories that are able to separate themselves from, you know, all of the same tropes and all of the same assumptions that we've been kind of brought up to believe are, you know, all an integral part of our culture. I'm hoping this is the start of it.
So that has been episode 3.
I think that is definitely more than half the bottle.
That's a bottle and a half, I would call it.
I think so. All right, guys. Thank you for sticking with us. James, what are we going to be doing next for the podcast? Are we going to be doing some Doom Patrol, do you think?
Yep, we're going to look at the spiritual flagship of our show. That milieu of genres and nonsense that is Doom Patrol. We're going to go into season 1. We're not doing an episode-by-episode guide to Doom Patrol because we don't want to confuse people too much. we're going to stick to one episode guide at a time, but
there are only so many hours in the day, and we do not have time to go episode by episode, as much as I would love to do it.
So we're going to look at Doom Patrol as a show, and specifically look at season 1 of Doom Patrol in episode 4 of F Sobriety. So if you are a fan of Doom Patrol, or even if you've never heard of it, we'll try not to spoil too much, but there will be spoilers. But probably the thing about Doom Patrol is, if we spoil it, you'll still love it.
If you, for some reason, you've been attracted to our podcast because you've got a general vibe that we're into things like Twin Peaks and Mr. Robot and comic books and whatnot, there's no reason not to love Doom Patrol. Doom Patrol's an amazing show that pays great homage to its source material, but you also do not need to be familiar with the source material. And as we waxed about it in our first episode, it's a show that defies all the odds and throws so many things together, and is a great show, and I'm sure we're going to have a good time talking about it. So please do, if you have not checked out the show, check it out, and if you're a fan of the show already, then hopefully you'll have a good time joining us for our chat about that.
Alright, so hopefully we'll see you then. Thanks for sticking with what I believe is our longest episode so far. If you're a fan of Lovecraft Country and you disagree with our take on it, that's your prerogative. Feel free to...
as Bobby Brown would say.
Feel free to disagree with us on Facebook at facebook.com/FSobrietyPodcast, Podcast, on Twitter at FSobrietyCast, or look on YouTube for youtube.com/FSobrietyPodcast, Podcast, and let us know what you think, and if you're really lucky, we might give a fuck.
Thanks for listening, guys. Take care. That is absolutely, unequivocally off the bottle.
F Sobriety, Episode 3, Schlock and Awe, was conceived and produced by Craig Woods and James Hamilton, edited by James Hamilton, and is a production of Off the Bottle. The theme music is Colossal Estates by Errors, from the album Lease of Life, available on Rock Action Records. F Sobriety is on Twitter at FSobrietyCast, on YouTube at FSobrietyPodcast, and we still use Facebook, at facebook.com/FSobrietyPodcast. Y'all behaving in here?